really focus on what is the way forward? How do we share our knowledge as stakeholders who care deeply about prevention of conflict, peace building, conflict in the widest sense of the word, when we're talking about the climate crisis, when we're talking about gender-based violence, when we're also talking about conflict within countries and different regions. I am Femi Oke. I'm your forum facilitator. Today, 3 sessions: governance, the role of the private sector, and also, this is really, really intriguing, the future of peace building. What do you foresee for the future of peace building? This is a conversation that will go far and wide, not just here on our Zoom webinar, but also around the world via social media. 2 hashtags for you. Hashtag looking at the forum, and then also a hashtag that talks about development for crisis. So hashtag development for crisis, hashtag prevention forum. Conversations in this forum today, in the little Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. Your comments, your thoughts go into the Q&A box. So let us get started today, because you will hear from experts in the fields who are sharing their knowledge, interested to hear your knowledge as well as our 3 big sessions. So we will start our conversation today. Standing by, we have Okuna Eziakomwa. She's the Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa for the UNDP. Huna, it is so good to see you. This is day 2 of a global forum that is the first Prevention in Action Forum for the UNDP. I know you're going to bring some perspective from Africa. When you were sitting thinking, what do I need to tell the forum? What was the first thing on your mind? What was the most important thing?
Promise.
Without hesitation. Looking forward to hearing more from you. Over to you, Ahuna.
Thank you, Femi, and really great to see you as well. And thanks for really doing this. This is such an important topic for all of us. So, I will try and focus my conversation or my discussion a little bit around the region, Africa, which is the region that I cover. Today, we're talking about the development pathways for conflict prevention and peace building. Prevention and sustainable peace building really demand that we address the root causes of violent conflict. I know that sounds a bit like a cliche, but it's fundamental. It's not about dealing with the symptoms. We have to look at the root causes. And in fact, the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development seeks to do just that by putting the emphasis on inclusion, on equality, equality of access, on human rights protection. These are core values and principles that really underpin our ability to build peace. The pathway to conflict prevention and peace building in UNDP's book has to make that connection between, really connecting the dots between prevention, peace building, and sustaining peace. And within this framework in the Africa region, UNDP homes in on 4 key principles. 1 is prevention, 2 is stabilization, 3 is transformation, and 4 is sustain. So when we talk about prevention, is really that we invest in all the things that we need to do before a crisis unfolds to prevent those crises from happening in the first place. Second is, once the conflict is there, say we couldn't do anything and there is still conflict. We need to invest in ways that stabilize the communities, the population that's affected by the conflict, even while the conflict is still going on. And then eventually we need to invest in economic transformation because that's what secures the population and ensures human security in the long term. And then we need to make sure that we sustain those investments against shocks that happen, whichever way we look at it, whether it's natural disaster shocks or other shocks. So then I think the overarching goal of this approach that we have in these 4 areas is really to deliver on both the UN and African Union peace, security, and development agenda. And I would say there are 4 underlying objectives here: preventing violence, conflict, and war by addressing underlying structural fragilities, inequalities, grievances, and governance challenges more systematically and consistently, including looking at pre-crisis settings. The second is scaling up integrated and strategic search support to countries in transition, which are at a critical juncture undergoing political transformation. We see many of these countries, for instance, in the Horn of Africa, the Sahel region, and also the central and western parts of the region. And the third is maintaining long-term sustained support to countries and regions in crisis and protracted conflicts, such as the Lake Chad Basin that affected countries like Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and the whole Liptaka-Guma triangle involving Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where not all the country is in conflict, but you have pockets or regions that are really stressed with conflict situations. And in achieving these objectives, we have to put local communities, and in particular women and youth, as the key actors that's a critical component of the approach. We know that the continent of Africa is the world's most youthful continent, with projections putting Africa's youth population at about 460 million by 2050. That's almost double where we are today. Therefore, UNDP's programs and the work that we do and investments with our partners is really to ensure that youth form the spine of our programmatic investments. And that includes investing in ways that recognize the talent of youth, that nurtures that talent and integrates that talent. And I call it making talent mobile. As we look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area today, for instance, that's one of the avenues to ensure that we begin to integrate Africa's youth talent. And this approach also enables upstream conflict prevention, which is embedded in people and institutions. In applying this approach, I would like to maybe highlight a couple of examples. The first, I already mentioned, I work in the Lake Chad region, where we have a regional stabilization program and strategy. Looks at this nexus between the humanitarian development and peace issues in that Lake Chad area. It basically calls us to have a new way of working, and recognizes that critical role of different stakeholders and the imperative of coordination among stakeholders at various levels. And in support of the implementation strategy, for instance, last year, we had an inclusive approach looking at a whole of society multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad Basin, a plan of action on strategic communication for prevention of violent extremism, which was developed with the support of UNDP. And the process involved community consultations with representatives from affected communities, and included marginalized communities like the Kanuri, the Buduma, and the Kenembu leaders and their women. Supporting national capacities for conflict prevention is really key. And this also helps us to sustain peace. This is a significant portion of what we do in UNDP. I'll give you an example in supporting for instance, the establishment of the national peace infrastructure. We call them national peace infrastructures in countries like Malawi, in Ghana, in Kenya. In Ghana, with levels of citizens' trust in public institutions decreasing over the years, UNDP contributed to increased citizen participation and social mobilization by engaging women and youth in governance and political processes. And through its multi-stakeholder consultative platform on peace and governance, we also strengthen the capacity of peace architectures to reduce electoral violence and political vigilantism in Ghana. And collaborating with the National Peace Council, we had over 1,000 stakeholders in all regions who were engaged to become champions of peace, contributing to the peaceful elections that the country just had. And then I want to talk about borderlands. This is a region that hosts about 270 million Africans. It is a fertile ground for violent conflict due to structural and historical marginalization. But this region, the borderlands, it's also home to the most resilient people in Africa. And we need to invest, for instance, in projecting the voices of those who live in our borderlands and tap into their homegrown solutions and knowledge about their challenges. And this is what UNDP has started to invest in by recently launching the Africa Borderlands Center, ABC. It treats border regions as distinct economic and political zones in their own right. And the center here will offer specialized expert knowledge and technical advice coming mostly from the people themselves that will enable us to better design and implement programs that are suitable for conditions in these regions. And this year we launched an innovation challenge, for instance, to identify and document local solutions that inform the emergence and scaling up of new models of implementing development interventions on informal cross-border trade, for instance. And this will have a broader contribution to peace and stability in these regions. And maybe one last example is what we do with youth. As part of our youth focus, it's UNDP champions and supports what we call Youth Connect, a program that is now in just over 24 countries on the continent and growing. And the initiative really seeks to fill that gap between youth and opportunities. And it serves to connect young people to economic opportunities, productive resources, peers, and role models, and offers avenues through which youth can participate in leadership and decision-making processes. And our goal really is to offer this Youth Connect platform beyond the African continent and create an opportunity for international South-South and triangular cooperation between youth of Africa and other parts of the world, so they begin to connect and seek solutions together. And our partnership with the Tony Elumelu Foundation to reach about 100,000 young Africans with business development services and solutions and access to finance over the next few years is just one practical expression of that investment. So let me perhaps start to close by saying the following. As we look ahead and continue to contribute towards the development pathways for conflict prevention and peace building, there are important development challenges and opportunities to consider, particularly those that have been brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has been matched with increased digitization, for instance. New communication technologies and global supply chains are facilitating global growth, information exchange and participation, but also the spread of misinformation, hate speech, transnational gangs, organized crime, and radical extremist groups. So we need to further explore how to leverage on these new communication technologies for positive development rather than negative. And there are important investments that we could make there. National governments are finding it increasingly difficult to meet the expectations of their societies, particularly in this COVID-19 context. And in many countries, we're seeing the social contract unraveling, as witnessed particularly through social unrest and violence that we've seen across the world, not just in Africa. And the social contract is key to maintaining trust and building cohesive societies that are resilient to risks such as radicalization towards violent extremism. So support can be provided also to development of contextualized tools and approaches to address this trust deficit that is on the increase. And we see funding to conflict prevention and resolution, peace and security remains a small proportion of overall ODA. The continent needs to explore the potential opportunities presented by the AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which I mentioned earlier, that has a huge potential to influence things. In conclusion, while conflict prevention remains a national imperative, there are supportive roles for other actors to play. And on our part as UNDP, while supporting local and national capacities of conflict prevention and peace building, contributing to development in Africa, we are also enhancing our engagement with the African Union, the regional economic communities, as sustaining peace is a responsibility of all of us and calls for more integrated, strategic, localized, and coherent approaches. And we fervently remain committed to this process, because without it, there is really no development. Thank you. Back to you, Femi.
Ahuna Isiakonwa, I can tell you're a very busy woman because your phone has not stopped messaging you since you've been starting.
My computer, I'm sorry about that.
That's perfectly fine. There is work to be done, and that just emphasizes that. Thank you so much for starting off day 2 of our Prevention in Action Global Forum 2021. If you missed or you haven't seen sessions 1, 2, and 3, they will be available for you to watch, for you to use as resources and inspiration on developmentdialogues.org. Developmentdialogues.org. They will be there in a few hours' time. The Development Dialogues are a series of talks, conversations, virtual events between now and June, which really looks at the way of how do we reinvent the way the UNDP and think about new ideas for the way the UNDP deals with crisis situations. I highly recommend you not only bookmark developmentdialogues.org, the microsite, but also follow the events between now through to the end of June. We move on today, though, with a really important session about governance, peace building, prevention. Hello, Sarah Lister. Really good to see you. Sarah, I've been sneaking around your social profile. It says, passionate about democratic governance. That is good. A lot of people are, but it's the second bit that I love. And measuring it, right? You can be passionate about whatever, but if you're not measuring it, what do they say? If you're not measuring it, what is the point?
Exactly. And measurement itself can be a process of strengthening democratic governance, because it gives people a chance to articulate what their demands are. So measurement in the governance sphere is very, very special. It's not just about reporting and accountability to people who fund. It's about actually giving people an opportunity to make their voices heard.
This forum, Sarah, is going way beyond the UNDP family. So I will just say for people who are outside of the family, but now you're very welcome to be inside the family. Sarah Lister is Head of Governance, Bureau for Policy and Programme Support at the UNDP. She's also a pretty spectacular moderator. Sarah, over to you.
No pressure there. Thank you very much, Femi. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure for me to have been asked to moderate this session on the governance path to prevention, the role of government institutions in sustaining peace-building outcomes. And we have a really distinguished, I don't want to call them a panel, because our aim is that we have a conversation amongst ourselves this morning on this critical topic, and we hope to bring you all into that conversation as well. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed weaknesses within governance systems in conflict-affected settings, and it's compounded already dire humanitarian situations. We only have to turn on our televisions to see those terrible pictures on a daily basis, and many of us live in those contexts, and we don't even need to have the news to report them to us. It's destroyed livelihoods, it's threatened social cohesion, it's strained the capacity of governance institutions, it's tapped into simmering discontent and destroyed further trust in the state, the trust that Ahuna was just talking about. It may have also, in some contexts, created a tipping point for demanding reform. The global trends reflect increasing levels of a lack of accountability, weakening judicial independence, non-comprehensive service delivery, weak public sector capacities, and shrinking civic space. And we know that this can also create a vicious cycle, that in those very contexts where better action from government institutions and the state are needed, those crises undermine the capacity to do that. So core governance and rule of law systems and institutions are further weakened, and the crisis spiral continues. So we have a fantastic panel here to discuss with us this morning how we can work towards achieving sustainable development and lasting peace, when that depends on the presence of a robust governance infrastructure and capable institutions. So I will introduce briefly the four people who will be having this conversation with me this morning, and then I will pose a few questions and ask a couple of you to pick those up. We have Alina Rocha-Menukal, who is the Principal Research Fellow in the Politics and Governance Program at the Overseas Development Institute, and a long commentator on these issues. Alina and I have worked together on these issues for more years than I care to say on a public panel, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us this morning. We also have Koji Sakane, who is currently Chief Representative of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, in Sudan. Before that, he was a Senior Director of the JICA Peacebuilding Office. We have Georgiana Braga Oriad, who is UNDP's resident representative in El Salvador. And we have Brian Kagoro, who is Program Support Division Director of the Africa Regional Office Open Society Foundation, and also a former UNDP colleague. Brian, it's great to see you again. They all have distinguished biographies, which you can find online, so I won't use more time on those now. The first question I would like to pose, which I think is actually essential to opening up this discussion a bit, is what is the role of institutions in the prevention agenda, and are we talking about them enough? So from my perspective, as somebody who works on governance issues all day and perhaps spends less time in the peace-building discussions, it's pretty obvious that institutions are central to this discussion. But actually, in the prevention and peace-building space, what is our discussion on institutions? Alina and Georgiana, would you like to pick that one up? Alina.
Sure, yes. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be in this panel with everybody. So very briefly, because I also have heard from Sarah that she's going to be sticking to time very rigidly, so I have to make sure that I get my stuff in 3 minutes or less. So just to say, and I think this echoes the remarks that we have heard previously, but COVID-19 has highlighted with renewed urgency why governance and institutions matter and why they matter so much. Although the virus represents a health, humanitarian, and economic challenge, it also has governance dimensions that are essential for understanding what prospects there are to build back better and to foster states and societies that are more peaceful, inclusive, and resilient. COVID-19 has laid bare and accentuated frailties and fault lines in political systems and the social contract that have been brewing in the context of widening inequalities within and between countries since at least the 2008 financial crisis. And those who have suffered most and have been most exposed to the health, economic, and political fallout of the crisis are those who were already left behind, often on the basis of multiple and intersecting identity-based inequalities, including gender, race, ethnicity, class, etc. So institutions are essential to the prevention agenda because depending on how effective, accountable, and inclusive they are, they play a fundamental role in channeling different interests, needs, and demands, addressing collective challenges and mediating conflict in ways that ought to be more peaceful. It is not for nothing that back in 2011, the World Bank's World Development Report on conflict called legitimate institutions, quote, the immune system of functioning and resilient states. I think it's also really important to remember that when we talk about institutions, we're talking about both formal and informal institutions. And it is in effect the interplay of how formal and informal institutions interact, So the rules and regulations on paper and informal institutions of how things work in actual practice, that interplay is essential to understand potential for fragility or resilience. And in this and how this interaction plays out, how the rules of the game are that which are formal and informal are defined, contested, and reshaped, for example, in terms of who is included and excluded, and how and why, hinges on underlying political settlements and power dynamics. So I just want to highlight here that not only institutions and governance are central, but also the politics behind them that give them substance and meaning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alina. It's very important points to underpin our conversation. Georgiana, how does that play out in the context that you have been working in?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Sarah, I'll have a disclaimer here, because we had initially the question that was on institutional transformation before we came to this one when we discussed yesterday. And then we transformed the question into what is the role of the institutions. And I think this is the key question. And why am I going back to the first question? I think because we do need a debate that sometimes internationally our counterparts are not so patient in talking about consolidation of the institutions. And very often we rush into transformation on institutions that are not yet consolidated. The consolidation translates into trust and legitimacy, and I think that's a key question. And therefore, your question on the role is really key. I'd like to really quickly go through 3 examples, very concrete, as you asked us for. Well, as many of you know, El Salvador has a very recent democracy peace agreement, so about 30 years of peace. And this weekend, we were just going through elections. So, and at the center of these elections, there is the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, which is supporting to run smooth and fair elections. It is in the center of this effort. Even though the tribunal has been gaining experience over all of these years, and probably has never been so prepared as into these elections this year, we have seen that it has never been so criticized. And why? Because of a new item that was an electronic vote counting system. So that was the novelty that really created lack of trust. And how can we help in these situations? The UNDP local office was asked in 2 weeks by the tribunal to prepare a simulator that could help the people who are going to work on the vote countings to emulate these systems and actually practice beforehand, before the D-Day. This was something that is very simple, but the observers from the electoral missions pointed out as a best practice. We also helped to put all the COVID signs. That was also something very simple, but also something that helped the smooth organization of the voting centers. We also supported the Attorney General Office with kits for their mediators, so that their mediators could have the COVID kits, but also that they would have an app where citizens could sort out issues at last minute. So these are very simple actions, but that is also helping consolidate and actually put something on the ground. Another example I'd like to bring to you here is the National Police. The National Police is also something that is another institution at the center, at the core. And their archives have been for 30 years in boxes. So through the PBF, we are supporting the police also to systematize and to digitalize 30 years of archives. That not only dignifies the role of the police officers who can actually have their records, and their records means not only the sanctions, but also the promotions, the transfers, workshops, permissions, sickness, everything. But also allows for transparency of these processes, and now they are digitalized and accessible to the police officers and also to the public that may need. So this is something that is 20 years of archives in the police system. And just one last example that I wanted to put very concretely here. We heard from Murad yesterday about the broader notion of conflict prevention. So I think that the key point also is to think about conflict at home and what is impacting our women. And this is something that is very, very key. So with some MPTF COVID funds, we supported the Minister of Health in delivering medicines for people at home during the biggest heat of the crisis here in the lockdown, so that people did not have to come to the hospitals to get their medication. And that was done through the post service. The interesting part here was that not only we have helped the postal office to be able to deliver this medication, but we also helped them to be trained with information to identify violence against women, so that women could actually alert the postal office's staff. And also we have on the packages and a little stamp with the name and the context for the Attorney General services that actually serves women. So these are very key, small, simple actions in consolidation of trust. And I think this is something that we should be talking about more, rather than going into transformation, but helping really build and consolidate this legitimacy and this trust with the public. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Georgiana. I think it's really helpful to have these very practical examples of how some of these processes play out in a country context, and how actually some particular interventions can help support trust in very complicated situations that might spin out of control or go in a negative direction. Next, I'd like to turn to Koji and Brian and ask them about the challenges to institutional transformation in fragile and conflict affected settings. What have you seen from the environments and the context that you have been in? Koji, maybe you would like to take that one first.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, thank you very much for coordination. I agree with Georgiana about the importance of the trust. It is quite important. However, we should also recognize about the situation that fragile and conflict affected country is sitting. I mean, for the many countries doesn't have experience of providing for the good governance, and most of the country has a very limited experience after independence. So they are under the process of struggling about how to create for the space and the relationship between government and people. So we should support such kind of struggle. So the institution building is our institution transformation is quite important, but they are also under the difficulty of how to create for such kind of capacity. That's why our international society should support such kind of capacity. And one more thing I would like to mention about the local government capacity. Most fragile and conflict affected countries, the function of local government is failed because central government is okay. However, the local government is the center of direct provision of the service to the people. But this function is completely failed or collapsed during the process of conflict. We should address how do we support the function of local government, local governance function. It must be a quite important thing. So I stop here at this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate you highlighting particularly that aspect of the local governance and the criticality, because we know that in many contexts, actually, local governance systems are those that people interact with on the first line. We've seen that in the COVID response, and we've seen it in multiple conflict affected and crisis settings. Brian, turning the same question to you, and maybe you also want to reflect on the local piece, what are the challenges that you see to institutional transformation in these contexts?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, UNDP for the invitation. Well, there are root causes, but there are also soil causes and climatic or neighborhood causes. I'll explain why that formulation. The first problem I think it's the nature and reality or context of fragility, as Saki has said, and Alina said earlier, and Georgiana. If you take South Sudan, for example, the reach of institutions, and that's the point Saki is making, is limited. And therefore, where impact is most desired is not where our investment in institutional transformation happens. It normally happens in the center, and yet where it's needed the most is on the periphery. And these spaces, academics often refer to them as ungoverned spaces, but I think those who are practitioners know that these spaces are self-governed spaces. And this ability to understand, as Alina was saying, how governance happens, not in the formal sense that we understand it. In fact, let's not call it informal because it's formal for those people. And that would be true if you're looking at Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, or right now the Tigray crisis. Number two, I think it's useful to look at the nature and meaning of institutions. In whose image are those institutions, right? The state-society relations that Saki was talking about. Rather, what institutions matter the most to the locals? So you realize that, as Alina and Georgiana and others said, the disconnects may be socio-cultural, that the way the peace is built or conflict is prevented is different from how a particular institution is oriented. It may be related to the illegitimacy question, the legitimacy of service, that there's no service provision, legitimacy of power, because those seeking to exercise authority and power are legitimate, and illegitimacy of performance generally. So if you're looking at that, Sarah, that means the legitimacy, local trust issues are important if you want to accelerate change, but the mutuality between government and people. And so this is a conversation not just about the state of the state as this entity with a monopoly of use of force, control over territory. In many areas that Auna was talking about, the ability to offer security from the central government is diminished. Even so, you need to look at other actors that are doing so, which therefore means, I think that if you're looking at challenges of how power is exercised, of how people necessarily relate, is you have to look at the cultural leadership as key. And I think that's some of the things that we're learning. So whether you call them traditional leaders, religious leadership, and in certain instances, multinational corporations doing extractive work have more influence on the whole government and government systems. And in other areas, Central African Republic, Mozambique at one time, private military companies that normally are not in the conversation about state building, and more the role of technology. So I'd say that the challenges are contextual, structural, political, legal, or social cultural. And they are also economic, but the superstructural problems of power, influence, and leadership, people, knowledge, and needs, process, and development outcomes become key. The mediating factor is knowledge. Mediating factor is trust. Mediating factor are resources. And mediating factor is us who go in to empower, transforming our notion of appropriate institutions from the classical institutions we used to what works best on the ground. And that's what we learned from the Rwandans in Gachacha, and what we are learning in South Sudan, and we learned in Northern Uganda. And UNDP is well schooled in this.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I think you raised the issues which also bring us to a question I understand we've had in the chat box about, what type of institutions are we talking about here? And are we talking formal? Are we talking informal? And you've raised some, you've problematized those very terms. And the fact that within the peace building world, the infrastructures for peace conversation is very comfortable with the informal institutions, and also I think increasingly in the governance world that there's.
Which part do you work in? You said you're in UNDP, right?
No, already I am working.
I'm sorry, could colleagues please mute if they are I thought they were objecting to my comments about formal and informal institutions. But I think the critical, we're starting to get to the critical issues here around how do we manage both the formal institutions and the informal, if you want to, if you want to categorize it like that. And for organizations that are working, how do we bring those aspects together at all levels, as Koji said? So it's not just the national, it's the subnational, but it's also the cross-border aspects. So with that whole package of complexity, I'm going to ask Aline and Georgiana to answer that question and say, what, with all those complexities that we've been talking about, what are the critical aspects of governance processes and institutions that should be further supported? Alina, do you want to take a first stab at that?
Sure, yes. Thank you very much, Sarah. So, as we have been talking about, COVID-19 has crystallized the centrality of governance in addressing the diversity of challenges brought on by the crisis. And here governance involving both informal and formal institutions and how they interact to shape the rules of the game. But I think what has happened with the COVID crisis is that it has also helped to crystallize that some elements of governance have been less relevant than others. So for example, regime type, whether a country is a democracy or an authoritarian system, has been less decisive in terms of how effectively they have responded to the crisis. We have, to the COVID crisis at least, we have examples of democracies performing well, while others, including some of the world's most established democracies, including the UK, where I'm based, and the United States, have not. And the same has held true for authoritarian systems. Some have done well and some have done less well. So Francis Fukuyama has written an article not too long ago, I think in the Journal of Democracy or Foreign Affairs, I'm not sure, where he highlights what in his perspective have been the key institutional underpinnings of successful response to the COVID crisis. And I think what he highlights are important beyond the COVID crisis to understand prevention and response in general. So the three main factors that he talks about are state capacity, social trust, and leadership. And I think these are three things that we have talked about here as well. And what he highlights here has resonance in the broader literature on governance and development. So this rings true. Historically effective states that are supported by leaders who have a long-term developmental vision and can bring people together as part of a shared national project have been vital in fostering peace, driving progress, and promoting equality and inclusion. These kinds of states that have been able to deliver shared prosperity and well-being have also enjoyed the trust and legitimacy of the population. However, they have not always been democratic, and there's nothing about democracies that automatically makes them more effective or better performing. And I think this is an important point to highlight because we may have a normative sense of what we want the world to look like and how indeed things work out in practice. And one of the key insights from the literature or existing evidence is that inclusion in terms of process, as in a democracy, does not inexorably lead to inclusion in terms of outcomes, as in prosperity and development. So we can't assume that all good things naturally come together sort of in easy ways. And let me bring Fukuyama once again. He has written earlier that and I'm quoting here, the miracle of modern politics is achieving political orders that are at once effective, inclusive, and accountable. So I think those are the three things that we are striving for. States that are effective, inclusive, and accountable, and can respond to the needs, aspirations of the population. But it is not at all clear how all three of these can be supported at the same time in ways that are mutually reinforcing. So that, I think that is the challenge at the table, which is quite a big one. And I think COVID-19 in a way is providing an opportunity or a juncture where we can start seeing how some of these power dynamics can be shifting, hopefully opening up processes for progressive change, but also perhaps not naturally conducing to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I think you've raised some really important points there. And you and I have been discussing these issues for many years. And I think we've also been looking particularly at the trust issue quite a lot at the moment. And I think you're right that accountable, inclusive, and effective are key aspects to it. The question is around what type of systems best allow that accountability, inclusion, and effectiveness to take root. And within, you know, for the purpose of this discussion, within fragile contexts. And I think we would all agree that kind of procedural democracies don't always allow that. And what we need as a community to be having is a conversation about, you know, what type of institutions and mechanisms allow those principles, which are the principles at the heart of ideas around democracy, to manifest in societies in ways that enable, you know, people to enjoy the benefits of them. And in crisis and conflict settings, that's particularly complicated about how we ensure those core principles can find their space. But I wish we were all sitting around a table to be having this conversation, because I think it's really important one to be having. But I will maybe hand the same question to you, Georgiana, and ask, you know, how does this conversation land within the country that you are now, or the countries that you have worked in previously? You know, what are those critical aspects that we should be supporting?
Thank you, Sarah. I think that Lena is bringing some key issues here, and I was trying to think what institutions can, or what do they do? No, well, the institutions they first can settle differences. They can facilitate consensus building. They can contribute to power sharing. They can also be a mechanisms to bring power close to the people. No, they can also facilitate opportunities of people to communicate their needs. And again, and they can be really a big source of trust in the system. So I think these are some of the key issues that we should bring and strengthen institutions in these directions. We have seen with the COVID a crisis of governance, and starting with governance and health specifically. No, in times of crisis, who decides on health? Is it the experts? Is it the top government? Who has this say? So I think that here we should be going back and thinking, where are these decision-making processes? And going back to what Alina was saying of the effective, inclusive, and accountable points, I had basically the same, that is inclusive, responsible, accountable institutions that have to be at the core, but also the national ownership and linked to the development, because this cannot be something that is completely detached. This is the core of development. Also, that is being coming back in many countries in the Latin American region is the social contract, and a new renewed social contract between citizens to say, okay, this is our governance and these are the institutions that we want to be strengthened. So I think that these are really key. And going back to Brian's point on the services, I think the services need to be really reinforced, and we really need to look into that concept of what is peace, what is conflict, and what are the territories where we're looking at this. And just for a concrete example, again, that I was asked to be very concrete, a concrete example is for women, transportation is a territory where they're not at peace, where they use every day, where they are attacked every day, where they suffer violence every day. So these are, when we think about the territories and peace territories, we're not thinking about the bus. And the bus can be a territory that is very violent and very aggressive to most women. So here in El Salvador, we started a PBF project with UN Women on women free of violence in the public transportation, and really to look at that space as a territory where women are not safe. And going at Brian's point of the services. So that actually going back to the service, going back to the performance, and going back to giving power to these women, so that that would be a territory where they feel safe. So really looking into these decompartmentalized services, I think that we go back to what Elena was saying about effective, inclusive, and accountable institutions. And that would be my points here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgiana. I think it's really helpful also to, shift our thinking around what type of spaces are we talking about. And I'd like to pick up this conversation then around, if it's not the, the tradition, I don't want to say traditional, if it's not the mechanisms of institutional practice that we are used to, particularly perhaps around democracy, democratic institutions, elections, parliaments, political parties, if it's not those mechanisms that are bringing the change to people's lives, are there other innovative institutional mechanisms or practices or spaces? Not that we should necessarily discount those altogether, but how, in this changing world with new opportunities through digitalization and other aspects, are there innovative practices that we should be looking to support that institutional transformation? Koji, over to you on that one.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to show you several examples. One is for the JICA's experience about the peer-to-peer knowledge share for the capacity building the local government. I mean, we JICA have a very strong network within Japanese society. So we are encouraging for the real local government officials from Japan to try to give their lessons to those who are involved in the local government service in fragile countries. We do such kind of exchange of knowledge, and Japan has an experience about 10 years ago. We experienced about the great earthquake, and we have find out that the local government function is failed because of the lack of the people. During that time, we find out about how the government work together with the community to making for the capacity supplement by the local government, local people. This is one of the good examples. It is very effective for the case of the fragile and conflict affected setting. So it is quite important to share the knowledge which is really conducting for the local government functions in Japan. So this is one of the examples JICA is doing. The other one is for the online communication through the fragile country and Japan. Due to the COVID-19, we have a very difficult situation for the contacting to the fragile countries and also conflict affected countries. We should use for the as a new kind of technology. Yeah, online is not always a new technology. However, online is still effective about how to exchange sharing for the knowledge. And we did it last year, and we found a very effective result on that. So, and also AI system or the other kind of modern technology should be used for the improvement of the quality of the providing of service. There might be many locations to expand. And one more thing I'd like to mention about the challenge or difficulties. We are now discussing within the community of development right now, but the conflict building, conflict prevention is not only the role of the development. I mean, for that, we should encourage for the other partners like HDP Nexus. I mean, for that, we have to borrow the power and the knowledge for the humanitarian actors, as well as the peacekeeping actors like Peacebuilding Commission. So we should expand such kind of discussion with other members. It is quite important. And throughout this session, we had some of the people are mentioning about the importance of human security. I completely agree with it. I mean, for the human security should be the center for, or the guiding principle for introducing for the many actors to be involved and make consolidated action to prevent and finalize conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And before I turn to Brian, just to note that we've got some very interesting questions coming in the chat box. I will be turning to posing some of those to our discussants in a minute, but if you do have other questions, please do put them in the chat box and I'll try to pick those up. But Brian, just returning to this question on innovative practices to support the transformation of institutions. What have you seen from where you sit?
Some of the most fantastic innovations are not technological in this area. The Maasais have a philosophy of life that says life is about the right to be, to become, and to belong. And if you just juxtapose that with the broad African philosophy of Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. And it has a second element that says I see you. It has three elements, which is crowdsourced solutions to any problem. You co-create mutuality, solidarity, social support. Number three, which is collective decision-making and collective responsibility. So for example, in 1994 in Rwanda, you had a famous statement by the women of Rwanda that said, we asked for justice and they gave us more laws, right? That there is a clear distinction around this. And they were imagining their citizenship as cultural, political, social, and economic. The same woman who's a victim of sexual and gender-based violence suffers the economic inequality and also has poor access to service that we were referring to. So the question that you are looking at the continent, at the innovations, what have we seen? Let me start with states. The states that have done best are those that are innovative, entrepreneurial. So I know we normally don't talk about entrepreneurial states, but entrepreneurial, developmental in orientation, and solutions oriented. And that's why it's correct. I think, Alina, we did a research when I was at the UNDP. We started doing this work. I think, Sarah, you were involved in it around the beyond regime typology conversation at the time, years back. And it is important for two reasons. The first is participation at the very local level is not simply about receiving service. It is about creating solutions. The humanization of the citizen, giving them agency and not just voice, right? Giving them the power to name their world and to create. So we saw from the 1990s, the Rwanda model where they needed justice, and the only way you could create their sense of justice was getting a broad-based participation, which didn't sit well with lawyers who wanted a strict accountability mechanism. If you look at what's happening with South Sudan now, with the hybrid models and all sorts of other things that are being put in place. If you look at Mali, you look at the Sahel region, the role being played by faith, being played by cultural leaders, but also by young people reaching across the line. The greatest innovation has been around, number one, wounded people become wounded leaders. And wounded leaders, it doesn't matter how reformed an institution is, as long as the leadership is wounded, which is a function of memory and experience, you are not going to have the sort of transformative effect. In African philosophy, the common belief in several African philosophies is this, that you humanize people first as the number one asset of development, right? You rehumanize them by, whether they were perpetrators, by buying back that humanity that they would have lost through conflict. So transitional justice, which UNDP has supported in many areas, and the African Union has developed a framework to do continental transitional justice, is an interesting mix of all the things we've been talking about, right? And a good African will tell you, it doesn't matter how many degrees, how much money you have. What happens at the village level is more formal than what happens in Oxford or Yale, right? It is the idea of formality being the function of power. But what does that mean for states that collect taxes, that receive all sorts of development assistance? It means the following, that in redesigning in the post-COVID moment states, it is useful for us to make sure they are flexible. Our experience when I was in UNDP is the public service was based on an old British system, which was based on longevity in the service, and therefore many young people would not make it. Never mind that we were asking through the structural adjustment for people to thin down, right? The public service was no place for young people. It took so long, it didn't matter how talented. So reimagining transformative, so where we are seeing, and we saw Rwanda, we saw a bit of Somalia and a bit of Ethiopia with all the challenges, Sarah, and I'll end with that, is that the ability to onboard skilled young professionals drawn from communities that are most affected. So that inclusion is not just body mass presence, but inclusion has its transformative, performatory, and other humanizing effect. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to hurry you slightly. I want to get to some of the questions, but I think you raised really critical issues there, around the cultural side and in an academic sense, the behavioral science side of how people see their world and how they experience their world, which then sometimes clashes with us as certainly from my side, sitting in a very formalized bureaucratic organization, and how to shift our views and our work so that we are able to accommodate better this complexity that we see. I'd like to pick up some of the questions that there are in the chat box, and I'd ask all the discussants to have a look at all of the questions and just pick up one or two that they would like to answer in the 10 minutes or so that we have remaining. Ferdinand from the Maldives, for example, says, how long does it take to change the governance culture, and what is used to make it authentic for people who have seen no governance but military aspects? What timelines are we talking about here? Nisan is saying, please could the panel talk to the challenge or give examples of preventing conflict through institutional building in contexts where governments may not be open to collaboration or offer limited collaboration with the UN system. And then there's another question around how do you elaborate? Could you elaborate on how institutions contribute to prevention through public employment in addition to service delivery? I also see a question from Erin McCandless. We also need to clarify what we mean by institutional transformation versus reform. Do we not need to link the concept of building trust with authentic efforts to uproot drivers and root causes of conflict? The roles that international actors play in tricky contexts around this is also worthy of discussion. So there's more there than we can tackle in the 10 minutes we have remaining, but I will go back to each panelist for a couple of minutes to comment on any of those, plus anything else that the conversation has sparked off. So your responses and any closing thoughts you have. Alina, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm sorry if you guys saw one of my children here. So I was trying to tell him that I was in the panel. Thank you all very much for the questions, which are very inspiring. I'm afraid I'm not equipped to answer all of them. And I think people in the audience who are asking some of these questions would be very well placed, in fact, to address some of them. But just briefly to highlight, I mean, I think what happens in conflict-afflicted settings is really quite challenging, because these are all settings that are trying to transform along many different dimensions all at once. So obviously from violent conflict to peace, but also from weak and ineffective states to states that are more effective and capable, from closed and exclusionary political orders to more open and inclusive ones, from narrow and exclusionary sense of nation to a more inclusive sense of nationhood and imagined community, from personalized systems of interaction to ones that are grounded in the rule of law, and from stagnating or narrow-based economies towards economies that have greater investment and shared growth. And all of these dimensions are playing out live, and there are a lot of different tensions and trade-offs that emerge from that. So as a result of this, I think it's really just important to keep in mind that all of these objectives are equally worthwhile and are incredibly important priorities, but they may actually play out against each other, and there may be difficult trade-offs and tensions that need to be addressed. A key role for institutions is hopefully to be able to deliver on what people's expectations and needs are, because I think people, as we have seen, are demanding to be included, not just in terms of process, which is what happens in a democratic system where at least there are some mechanisms to participate and to have incidence in policy-making processes, but also in the outcome of how development and prosperity are shared. And these two are really important equally. And I think the challenge, as per what I was saying earlier, is how to bring them together. So the person who was asking about service delivery and job creation, all of these things, if the state is capable of responding to key needs and aspirations of the population, that is a really important way of building trust. If the state is able to provide spaces where people feel that their voices are not heard, but also acted upon, that's also a very good way of trying to build trust. But none of these things are given, and none of these things naturally come together. I just want to close my remarks by saying that historically, and this is one of the great sort of ironies of history, historically, the greatest strides to promote equality have not been achieved through democratic politics, but rather through very much more perverse means. And one of them has been pandemics. So we're now at a juncture where there is a pandemic, and the question is, can this pandemic actually open up space for more progressive change?
Thank you.
I leave you with that challenge.
Thank you, Alina. I'm working left to right across my screen. So Georgiana, you're next.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I'll grab a couple of those questions. I think that the timeline and to build trust, and I think we should think backwards. How is the timeline to unbuild trust? And because normally they are proportionate. As complicated, as more concrete, as more established institutions work, as more the fabric is well woven, this makes it more complicated to unbuild trust. So also more complicated than, therefore, to build trust back in the institutions. Normally, countries that are more fragile have institutions that are very young or they are very weak. So but that can be also a bit simpler to actually help them with simple steps to build this trust from the public, because they are comparing with something that was just absent before. So sometimes this part is actually faster. That doesn't mean necessarily on a long-term basis that it will stay, but on the first step, it could be faster, and then more of a long-term process of building. I really would like to also go back into this longevity and the body mass idea, because I think that we really should be thinking about long-term on why we're talking about institutions. We are talking about generational change as well. So this is very complicated very often when we're also compared to a pandemic, or we are really in the middle of something that is so drastically changing. Could be a pandemic, or it could be just change through technology as well that has accelerated so often change in our institutions. So here I would say as well that we need to build steps. Tradition very often helps as well, and even sometimes even bureaucratic processes can help these institutions to actually have their own rights, rights in RITES, so that they can, and these rights actually sometimes consolidate as well their steps. Just very quickly, an example going back to the elections here. I think that the Tribunal has had its rights and has had its steps, and those really helped build trust from the population, because they were expecting, okay, at this point this will happen, at this point this will happen, and this has happened in the past years, and that's what we are expecting it to come again. So those would be my points. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm not sure I was muted. Thank you very much. And thank you also for grounding this conversation also today in very specific examples, as have others who have been speaking. Koji, what are your final remarks or responses to any of those questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am so much impressed about the question, comment from Nathan. I challenge for this question. I mean, for the most of the country in conflict, feel they are isolated or their voices cannot be heard by the international society. And also in the conflicting party, both sides think their demand, their right are under the threat, and they try to protect themselves because other people don't support us. So the sense of isolation, exclusion is coming from the nature of the conflict. We should recognize about the nature, and I think root cause is a very important keyword. However, we should really think about how try to hear the voice of the conflicting party. What is the reason they are conflicting each other, or what is their final demand? It is quite important to hear the voice and try to open the space for the dialogue between both parties who are conflicting each other. And also for the space for the peace building, we should create for the space for the inclusive, tolerant society, which is very often vulnerable people, excluded people are within the community. Those people is some of the source of the conflict. That's why we should create how we could create for the harmonized, inclusive society. It is quite important things. And the external actor like us should be recognized that we are the just external actor. The local people should be the center of everything. So we should respect and encourage for the local ownership on all process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Over to Brian.
You know, I've really been mulling on this issue for some time. In common public sector reform speak or governance speak, performance is key, merit is key, and inclusion is key. If you think about a country that has 420 ethnic groups, a civil service of less than, let's say for argument's sake, 150,000, what might inclusion within the public sector look like? Because that notion of inclusion that was developed in societies that are bi-ethnic and so on and so forth, there's the cost of participation or of inclusion. But there's also the cost of quick wins, right? That this is not a microwavable solutions. But the second bit around merit is that merit can reproduce historical privilege or can actually turn historical prejudice into a monument and reproduce inequality. So if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement globally, what America is struggling with and the rest of the world around white supremacy and anti-Black racism, and ask yourself, America has been so-called democracy for so long. It is still struggling with first order things around inclusion, right? And we therefore, as we go into post-conflict settings or into fragile conflict settings, need to be mindful, Sarah, of these buzzwords that make academic sense, but when you bring them to the practical field, it's useful for you to say, we do need to build knowledge and skills because economies still have to perform. But lastly, beyond root causes, because root causes are perhaps easier to deal with. I keep referring to soil causes. Is the structure and thinking about economy problematic? Will it always reproduce inequality?
Thank you, Brian.
Okay, yeah, all right.
I'm very sorry to cut you short, and we did start a few minutes late, so I may take one more minute. I think that's a really excellent point to end on, that concepts that we use, we need to be looking at them again and seeing how relevant are they for people's lives. And in fact, we've had a wide-ranging discussion today across a whole range of issues related to institutions, formal, informal. Is that even a distinction that makes sense? What are the role of democratic processes in supporting accountability, effectiveness, and inclusion? Where is the behavioural? Where is the cultural side? But I think if there's one point that we've honed in on, it's been around this issue of trust and people's trust, and how can we be supporting the accountability, effectiveness, and inclusion that supports the trust that enables societies to function. And for me, those will always be governance discussions. And therefore, in this discussion on kind of fragile and conflict-affected context, the conclusion is, yes, we have to be talking about these core governance issues in order to support those people in those contexts that are so challenging. So I think at this point I will wrap it up. I will thank so much the discussants. I don't want to call you panelists. Thanks to the 140 or so people who have been online with us this morning, and hand it back to Femi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. If you want to share some of those wise words from the discussants from the past hour, you can do so. #Prevention Forum and also #Development for Crisis. This is a Prevention in Action Global Forum 2021, very first of its kind to be convened by the UNDP. So we've talked about governance today. We are now going to talk about the future of peace building. Who has that kind of vision? Hello, Michael Shipler. Nice to see you. Welcome to the forum. Wow. Looking to the future, projecting way beyond the decade of action, Michael. You're going way beyond that. Now, Michael, normally what happens if you're moderating is that you tell everybody else who is in your session. Nobody says anything about the moderator because it's not about you, but you are VP, Strategy and Program Quality at Search for Common Ground. Just for a moment, can you tell us what you do, what the Search for Common Ground does for any of our audience who's not familiar with your work?
Absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you. Search for Common Ground is a global peace-building organization. We have offices in 30 countries around the world, working to bring people together from across dividing lines to collaborate around their shared interests. And so that's really what we're about. We work with many of you. UNDP is a big partner of ours in almost every country where we work.
Michael, take us into the future now, the future of peace building. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we have a really interesting panel discussion for you today. We're going to do this talk show style. So rather than listening to each of our panelists give presentations, we're going to have a conversation, a discussion. It'll be more like a fishbowl in a way, where we're going to talk about 2030. We're going to really look at, down the road over the next decade, what does our field look like? What is the nature of conflict? What are the nature of peace building? What are the opportunities that are in our hands to really shape the entire dimension of the field? Before I kind of offer some framing points and launch with our discussion, let me just do a very quick introduction of each of the guests that we have today. So we have Lavinia Ademensa. Lavinia is the program director at WANEP, the West Africa Network for Peacebuilding, a wonderful organization that has had a huge influence on the thinking of many of us in the field, particularly had a huge influence on how I see this field. We have Victoria Carreras Lloveras. She's the Deputy Director and the Acting Executive Director of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPAC, also an organization that has really helped all of us to really look at how do we prevent violent conflict and not just to react to it. We have Sam Rizik, who's the Head of Conflict Prevention, Peacebuilding and Responsive Institutions at BCPR at UNDP, partner to probably most organizations here. We have Vasu Gundan, who's the executive director and the founder of the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, ACCORD, an organization that's been a thought leader for all of us. And we have Marcus Lenzen, who's the senior advisor for policy and programs at the UN Peacebuilding Fund. So we have actually a whole diversity of perspectives on this field, from funder to community peace builder to those working at national, political, and regional levels. And this really sets us up for a fabulous conversation. In our field, I think we all feel very much that this is a moment for our field. It's a pivotal moment where many institutions that have not defined themselves or thought about peace building as being a particularly important sector are suddenly recognizing how division, stark division, power inequities, conflict are actually key barriers to achieving or accomplishing solutions to the major problems that we're facing as humanity. And we're seeing from the secretary, from the head of the World Health Organization to security actors, to development actors, to human rights actors, to all major actors around the world are suddenly looking to us, calling us, asking for support. How do we actually build bridges, build relationships, build collaboration among people? And as conflict unfolds over the next decade, we have an opportunity to rise. We're no longer the kids outside the candy store looking in the window. We're really at the table. And the question is really, can our field rise to this moment? So we're going to start off really thinking about 2030 and what does 2030 look like? And so I'd like to open up with that as a question. What does conflict look like in a decade from now? So let me start with Marcus. And I wonder if you could, just tell us in a moment, what do you think conflict is going to look like in 10 years from now?
Thanks, Michael. So this will all be an experiment at doing what I think we as peace builders, we always like to deal with complexity and try to explain complexity in all its dimensions and then take a long time to do so. So to do this, as you said, CNN TV show style will be the challenge to rise to, and perhaps that is one of the key challenges for the sector already. If we think of peace building, sort of parts of peace building being around addressing, key issues that were back in the founding moments of the UN about helping to make sure there's freedom from want and freedom from fear. What I worry about that is going to be just more pronounced in 10 years is certainly around things we will not argue much about. Climate change, displacement, and resource conflicts, I think, will be even more pronounced. It's a big management of the commons problem that will be more pronounced in 10 years from now. All the trends we have on inequality, not least through the pandemic, are not getting any better. So that will stay with us in 10 years from now. And then issues, I guess the last session talked a lot about, that is about the undermining of trust and the polarization and the role that social media and plays in undermining this or driving people more into groupthink and connecting less, I think will all affect how people get into conflict with each other and fight, or rather not talk with each other in a more modest way. And I think another thing, lastly, the last session was also talking a lot about how long certain processes take. A key aspect of peace building, where we all come from, has often been dealing with legacies of past violence and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so on one hand, I think we need to think about societies, how long it took them, for example, to reckon with past atrocities, that it took, 20, 30 years before these moments came in the societies. So we have to ask ourselves, of the violent conflicts that are raging now, where will they be 10 years and what, however, these days will societies have at their disposal to remember and engage with us, given that the way we communicate these days through social media and digital has changed quite a lot from the way it was when truth commissions were, for example, first created a few decades ago. So let me stop there for now.
Thank you. Lavinia, how would you answer this question? From the array of places that Undp is working, how do you see conflict unfolding over the next decade? Oh, I wonder if Lavinia will come back to you. I see that you're still muted. Vasu, let me turn to you then and ask you the same question.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, I think, you know, the last year has, in a sense, completely changed the world. The pandemic, and if we look at, you know, where we're working on the continent mainly, the health crisis has, to a large extent, generated an economic crisis, and we expect that that economic crisis will generate a security crisis, which will lead to a humanitarian crisis. I think there is consensus now amongst most of us working in the field, whether this is in the civil society sector or in the interstate sector. And I had a long discussion today with the chairperson of ECAS, the Central African Mechanism, and we were of the same mind about, you know, the consequences of the pandemic. So I think on the one hand, the pandemic will leave an indelible mark in how it shapes a conflict on the continent, because we know that most of the countries will go either into recession or depression. And already we were struggling with the transformation of our economies from agrarian to industrial to services. And, you know, we were making quite a bit of progress on the continent, but that will now set us back several years. And several years means within this decade. So I think we're going to see huge challenges in this decade around how conflicts will manifest themselves, and then how we will deal with that. I think on the positive side, over the last 3 decades, we have developed a plethora of instruments. You know, the AU has one of the most advanced peace and security mechanisms, the African Peace and Security Architecture, to deal with conflicts. Unfortunately, simply because we did have a lot of conflicts, but it developed over 3 decades. You know, this is quite an advanced instrument. And I think over these 3 decades, we've also developed a lot of skills, structures and systems on the continent. So this will hold us in good stead, but it will be an extremely challenging environment. People are rapidly urbanizing through conflict through climate change on the one hand, through conflict on the other hand. And so that urbanization is happening without the transformation of the economy. So, you know, if we look at your own continent, we look at Europe, we look at Latin America and Asia, their development trajectory was such that as they were urbanizing, they were also industrializing. So low-skilled farm workers moving to the center were absorbed into factory jobs, and the successor generation into the services sector. And, you know, as the incoming commissioner, Mr. Bankole, said yesterday, development as freedom. So I think relevant for UNDP is this very issue. If there is no development on the continent, and we've already had a setback now with the consequences of COVID, if we don't move rapidly into a kind of, and I heard Hilda Hardeman yesterday talk about, you know, Europe's trajectory, which largely was also assisted by the Marshall Plan post Second World War. And if we don't have a kind of Marshall Plan coupled with some kind of re-energized governance that deals with corruption and all the rest of it, and then addressing those root causes of the transformation of our economies, I think our mitigation structures will be hugely challenged.
So thanks, Vasu. You're starting to point to some of the key fundamental underlying driving factors of conflict that will be shaping the trajectory. Massive population movements, urbanization, and an economy that is not transforming to keep up with the demographic shifts that are occurring. And this is a very global phenomenon. Lavinia, it looks like your connection is back. So let me turn to you, you know, with the same question, you know, with all the array of places that UNEP is working, how do you see conflict manifesting in 2030?
Well, to sort of continue from where Vasu left off, I think the whole, you know, question of, you know, the nexus, peace building, governance, development, I think that nexus is going to get even more closer. And when we look into the future within the next decade, when we look at the threat vectors, from a number of the dynamics that are currently going and looking at where they're heading, I think governance becomes a really prominent component that we cannot, avoid, and governance that sort of cuts across all levels. When we're talking about the next decade, obviously we can't leave out the conversation around youths. And if we look again at the trends, we're looking at 1.3 billion young people by the year 2030. Africa alone is going to have, over 200 million of those young people. And the question we ask is, looking at the current economic trends, if they are to stay the way they are, how can our governments, provide for such a young population? So those threats in terms of governance, education, health, employment, I think those are some of the key threat vectors that we're looking at, and how the conflicts will look like in the next decade. Related to that is also the whole issue of the resource-based conflicts. Again, with an explosion of populations, the question is, it has its positive sides. Are we able, looking at the current trends, are states able to respond to the needs that come with such growing populations? And how do we manage the limited resources that we have? Of which are already also being challenged by environmental factors. And so we realized that from a human security perspective, I think the threats will be many. And so peace building will now have to look at how do we prepare for these. I think it was mentioned that there's quite a lot that is being done now, which we can build on. But we can already see there are challenges to some of those potential responses or potential frameworks that we can use. The good news, and Vasu has already mentioned as well, is that there is some preparation that's ongoing. If you look at the Africa Union, ECOWAS is now also speaking about the 2050 vision. So within the spaces that we work in West Africa, we're seeing conversations that are already beginning around that. But we do have quite a long way to go in terms of actual concrete action to respond to some of them. But the threats are quite clear and glaring in our faces.
Excellent. Particularly, I appreciate all of those comments and the comment about the generation of youth, who are shaping social norms globally, who are going to be coming into institutions, who are demanding a different kind of response from the institutions in their lives to serve them. It's a really critical one. And we're seeing a generation of youth who are already organizing to try to craft a different 2030 than the trajectory that we're on. And organizing using technology, using ability to social network, creating shared visions for a different future. And we're seeing it, from the NSARS movement in Nigeria to Lebanon, to the United States, to Chile, globally. Sam, let me turn to you. You have a pretty broad and global view of this picture, and I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks, colleagues. So rather than repeating, maybe I'll say an additional few things, but there is one point that I would like to repeat, and agreeing with Marcus, I think the unfinished business of peace, reconciliation, transitional justice, and these kinds of processes are really quite critical to look ahead to. We heard that yesterday from Miriana speaking about Europe and Central Asia. We hear that continually about Arab states. We certainly hear that about transitions that are precarious in many ways in Africa, but other places as well. So I think that's one that I'd like to emphasize. A second one, I think there is, we need to be watchful over the next 10 years of a principles, values level discussion about what peace and peace building looks at. I think we're looking at yet another struggle between primacy of human rights, security, peace building, among other things that are happening as well. This doesn't necessarily happen amongst us as a peace building community, but when the great powers have this discussion, it trickles down upon everyone on this call and well beyond as well. So I think that's another space to watch for as well. I think complex fragility was mentioned by everyone. Look at some of these places that have a hurricane, a typhoon, a failed governance system, a social movement that's happening at the same time, plus add to that violent extremism, cross-border issues. That I think will be happening more and more. And here I recall one of the comments from Huna earlier today and from Brian earlier today. It's not really a question of how this will take place, but where this will take place. This can happen in ungoverned spaces, self-governed spaces, borderlands, etc. These do not amount to regional wars, regional conflicts, but they are cross-border, around natural resources maybe, and have the potential to have a big spark among countries and in a sub-regional too. I think the two other points that I'd like to mention are related as well. The governance systems, institutions, services, leadership that is just unresponsive to particular dynamics or particular needs, and how that inspires rapid movement, social protest. This is no longer a discussion about a slow burn or a simmer under the surface. This happens now very, very quickly and rapidly. It only takes a view of some of the recent elections, globally speaking, to see how discontent becomes turns into a social protest movement that can continue for months or for years in some cases, and how without addressing that peacefully, without making appropriate changes, that plunges a country into some kind of spiral that is very difficult for peace builders, for governance folks to address. So those are where I see some of the challenges. I'll stop here at the challenges, and maybe in the next couple of questions, speak a little bit about some of the opportunities as well.
I'm gonna come exactly back to that. Some of the things. Victoria, let's hear from you.
Thank you. You hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So yeah, let me try to add something different, but maybe from a civil society point of view, as we at GPEC are mainly local peace builders. We see the future with concern because of the trends that we are already seeing today. With COVID-19, we must take into account the renewed commitment to strengthened government powers, which might remain after the pandemic. And as a result, we see a global and consistent shrinking of civic space, which makes the work of peace builders more difficult and risky. To the same extent, there is a crisis of multilateralism, while the pressing global issues such as major conflicts, climate change, migration flows, etc., may indeed only be solved collectively. The crisis of climate change has a very diverse impact in different contexts, as we are already learning from our members. We do not have data on how climate impacts women or youth and people in the most remote communities. However, we do not have also a clear peace building response plan. And as such, it will be up to the international community to think about how to bring together somehow these jointed agendas further together and capitalize on principles of coherence rooted in local knowledge and expertise. So yeah, I think that what we see is that it will be very urgent, or more urgent than ever, to have a more coherent analysis taken into account gender, environmental, and human security factors. And in our view, the implementation of conflict prevention and peace building interventions, will need to be made through sustainable, comprehensive, and innovative civilian means. So yeah, we would like to see peace building moving towards more locally led and be more focused at regional and national levels. But maybe this is a discussion for later as well.
We're going to turn to this because I think this is one of you're putting your finger on one of the key, I don't want to call it a tension point, but one of the key questions that is confronting our field. how do we address major global trends, and how do we address regional and transnational nature of the most violent conflicts in the world, and also hold true to our understanding that the local level peace building has substantial effect on reducing violence. And those things exist simultaneously, and it's something that's worth delving into and looking to the future a bit on this, where communities are organized in different ways and people have connections and social relationships in different ways. So, with a quick round here, we've identified a whole host of trends that we're seeing already today, and that we feel like are going to shape conflict in a decade. A shift to state, a shift back in a way to state power, and closing civil society space, and a rise in authoritarianism, urbanization and major migration movements without economic transformation, global power competition, which is something that, as you watch the events unfolding in Myanmar over this week, over these weeks, we can see how global power competition is also shaping a conflict within a country. An increasingly connected generation of youth activists who are demanding a different sort of response from their institutions and are able to organize to demand that, and have generated enormous power through networking power. So we pointed to a whole host of things. I want to turn this to opportunities, and Sam, you mentioned that you'll come to them. So let me start that, because the next 10 years also presents us with extraordinary opportunities to actually tackle this challenge of violent armed conflict. And what are those opportunities, do you think?
Thank you, Michael. So I think a couple of things. One, part of this we heard yesterday, but part of this everyone here knows as well. It is not for a lack of analysis or a lack of framing for what needs to be done over the next 10 years. If you think about big frames, big milestones, we can think about the decade of action. We can think about peace building and sustaining peace, a prevention agenda. We can think about, just in UNDP terms, 3 or 4 or 5 years worth of country programming that are already aligned to and based on the need of our national counterparts. So really quite clear in some of the frameworks. It is also not for a lack of tools and methodologies. What we heard from the Commissioner-elect for the African Union Peace and Security yesterday is, he comes into a position where there are lots of tools that actually exist. It's a question of alignment, coherence, consolidation, making them more effective, etc. I think there are a couple of things, and maybe this builds a little bit on what Lavinia and Victoria also mentioned. I think it becomes a question of scale. How big and how quickly and how rapidly can we do much more of this work? And that is part of this integrated approach that we in the peace building and in the development field think about. It's not only about people capacity as insider mediators or local peace builders, but it's also about supporting an infrastructure that in many cases is brick and mortar, and in many cases an infrastructure for peace is in many cases about institutionalized relationships and about capacities in these institutions to move ahead as well. And then I think there will continue to be some gaps that are filled. What we've learned, I think, over the past few years is that there are particular areas and programmatic approaches that offer opportunities to do more and help communities, countries, partners exit out of them. Stabilization is a big thing now. 10 years ago, it wasn't necessarily the big thing. Addressing issues of climate security and climate change, I think that is important. What happens next with hate speech, etc., is really quite important online, and it's real time and very personal consequences on people offline being directly injured. So I see a lot of opportunities that are coming forward. And I just end with a point that I'll come back maybe in the next round, which is the partnerships angle. What does this mean in terms of the partnerships angle when you have, for instance, GPAC as a network of networks covering many, many countries, and how do those partnerships among civil society and between civil society and the UN system and academia, etc. Maybe I'll also come back a little bit later to part of the knowledge and research, which continues to be important and critical, and how we can together write things that turn into policy, that turn into good programming, etc. And I know that Marcus will come in on the funding to financing part. Back to you.
Lavinia, coming to you, we have this array of frameworks, targets from the SDGs forward. Do you feel that those offer us enough direction as a field to channel our efforts and our growth in terms of our influence? Are they relevant, and do you think they will continue to be relevant over the coming decade?
Yeah, I think for me, I don't believe that there is any framework or any mechanism that exists and and can is fit for purpose 100%. I think everything that we have only gives us some guides. I think one of the challenges that we've had, I think over the past 2 decades or so, is that we have tried to use these frameworks, line, hook, and sinker, and just sort of impose them on existing context. I think one of the things that becomes key in terms of moving forward is how are we looking at these frameworks from more of an adaptive perspective? How do we adapt these? And I think it also is the same argument I would raise for even capacity building. We built so much, we have claimed to build so much capacities, based on some of these frameworks that exist. But in actual fact, some of the capacities we've built are quite redundant, because what we have not focused on is building adaptive capacities, which is different from just building capacity. And in building adaptive capacities, we need to now recognize what already exists. What are the agencies that already exist? What are the resilient points that we can use to feed into some of these frameworks and capacities and methodologies that we apply to operationalize and achieve our goals. I think also related to that, and I think again, Samuel mentioned it, it's also about our patterns of engagement. So whether we're using existing frameworks or we're developing new frameworks, how are we designing our patterns of engagement with the various communities that we're engaging with? And how much of the local knowledge are we harnessing as we look into either developing or implementing or using these frameworks that exist? And I think in the next 10 decades, we cannot run away from this importance of local ownership, local knowledge, and the agency that exists, which has to feed into a co-created or co-created solutions, rather than acknowledging the agencies, which is what we tend to do at best, but not really bringing them into a co-created response action. And I think for me, that's one of the challenges if we have to assess ourselves.
Thank you. Vasu, what's your response to that? Particularly, I think this last point that Lavinia has made about the relationship between the need to co-create solutions that are enduring from the local level, but also have, relate to the broader forces and trends that are influencing and shaping conflicts at that local level. What's your response to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, Michael, I've been in this field now for 30 years. And, we've kind of worked in the most protracted conflicts. I think states themselves cannot solve these problems. This is evident today. I think we need a United Nations, and we need a strengthened United Nations without a doubt. But a United Nations that acts as a bridge builder, I think, because we're going into a very fractured world. I said the other day to some colleagues, we're going to be dealing with extremes, what I call, if you look at Shenzhen in China on the one side with its 12 million people or 14 million, and Lagos on the other side, one represents a ordered dystopian kind of future, and the other represents a disorderly dystopian kind of future. Both, unfortunately, will present us with, huge challenges as we move into the future. We're on a steep learning curve. The last 3 decades, yes, because it's only in the last 3 decades. All of what you see in the United Nations today didn't exist 3 decades ago. So if you look at, PBSO, PBF, MSU, even DPKO was in its fledgling state. Of course, yes, UNDP and all of that was there, but the peace and security instruments as we know them today, they were not there. So it's 3 decades old. We're on a steep learning curve, but we're at a crossroads right now. Whilst we're on a steep learning curve, we need firstly, the first thing I think we need to do is a reflection. What worked and what didn't work? And why are we where we are today? If you do a audit and you look at the balance sheet, we're not any better off today than we were 3 decades ago. In some instances, we're actually even worse off today. So we need to do, that assessment of where we are. Then we need to accept that all of us, in this field, we're in a kind of little incestuous family. Sam, all of us, Sam, we've been like, the same meetings, we've all been together all over the place. Now for many, many years, we meet each other all over the place. And I think that incestuousness is dangerous because it doesn't allow us for out of the box thinking. And I've come to realize that architects and engineers and neuroscientists, they also have solutions to these complex problems that we are going to face in the future. So why don't we bring them in a kind of think tank? I've had discussions with many of them, to say the future, especially our technological future, when we look at it, presents us with huge opportunities. But how do we actually use it to deal with these problems? And the problems we are dealing with, is, as I said, is the 2 extremes. So you've got the whole state system that is still there, but you've got a huge number of actors that increasingly are working outside the state system. So all of these insurgency movements, radicalized movements, etc., they're not in the state system, yet we have to deal with them. And now all of these criminal syndicates, drug traffickers, arms traffickers, human traffickers, they operate outside of the state system. So they are not susceptible or, even responsive to UN resolutions. So what does a UN resolution mean to all of these groups in the Sahel? Nothing. So we need to think this, and we need to think how, and these are going to be the predominant characteristics of the next decade. Drug traffickers, arms traffickers, human traffickers, they are proliferating across the continent. We are seeing insurgencies. And because the peacekeeping is under threat, we are seeing the rise of private military corporations. This is now going to be a new reality. So we're at this crossroads where, as a community, we've made huge progress. But we got to step outside the box now. And we got to say, how do we embrace all of these other people so that we can find solutions? And how do states understand? And let me also talk about national governments. And I'm happy that the assistant administrator is here. Assistant administrator, I'm happy that you're here with us today, because I think, we're going to have to deal with national governments, and because of the way the system is designed, yes, we have to deal with that. But city governments are going to become increasingly more and more important. It's where the theater of conflict will actually be. And unless the UN embraces, for example, United Cities and local government, 250,000 members across the world, in cities, in local governments, that's where the action is going to happen. That's where trafficking is going to take. That's the place where insurgencies are. Talk about Cabo Delgado, in Mozambique. It's in a local community, so we're going to have to deal with that. So I think, yes, huge opportunities as we go into the future, but let's step outside the box and collaboration. We have to come together.
Perfect. Thank you, Vasu. What also, in listening to what also strikes me is that most actors who are key parties to conflict are doing this. They are seeking to harness the power of networking relationships, the power of technology, neuroscience, advertising strategies, their array, engaging with the array of human knowledge to innovate insurgency doctrine. There have been massive innovations in insurgency doctrine, and you can see this with the transnational white supremacist movement and how it's innovating and utilizing and taking advantage of an array of other fields and not quite caught in its own its own conference circle. And I think this is really critical for us to understand and actually match. We have a couple of, and I'm going to keep coming back to you, but I want to turn for a moment and just share a couple of comments that are coming in from our colleagues around the world. We have one around gender, a comment from Ferdinand. I don't have your last name, sorry, but the role of women at every level must be boosted within this crisis and on an unprecedented scale. And we need to look to linking recent debates such as the Black Lives Matter movement to those about inclusion in developing contexts across the globe, encouraging a broader coalition calling for social change, justice, and equality. And so indeed, there is an organizing that is occurring among a generation of activists who are seeking to transcend national borders and who are saying, well, my local context is also a global context, and how do I relate those things? And we can see this happening, with the movement happening in Myanmar today, and how activists all over the world are responding, and how what has happened, in many other countries with the movements, as you referred to them earlier, Sam. So Marcus, I'll come to you as listening to Vasu's challenge, that we need to break out of the box. We need to seek to innovate in the same way and actually catalyze the leap. What does that look like?
I mean, I generally agree with them. What does it look like? There's a few thoughts that come to my mind. I mean, so on one hand, I do think the discussion about whether the peacebuilding sector, right? I very much agree with Vasu that we have to overcome a dichotomy where on one hand it has become much more institutionalized, at different levels, whether it's in the UN or also the civil society networks and how they've come to be organized as an institutionalized sector. And yet the broader undertaking for peacebuilding was always about that it needed a lot of other things to be done differently, right? In terms of justice and tackling inequality and so forth, that are not just the job of one sector that on its own is somehow going to resolve all violent conflicts. And I think that is still, just to echo what Vasu said, I think that is a challenge that has to be overcome, because I also get quite frustrated these days with things where you think we've come a long way in a few decades of this institute, and yet we are still struggling and using sort of tools to try to get other development actors to be more conflict sensitive, or governments to be more conflict sensitive, and are still using the same tools we tried to roll out 15, 18 years ago. And I think something is not working there. So there's something that we need to rethink about some of our essential toolbox sort of in the sector of getting this brought out. I think speed is for me a key word to think through. On one hand, if we're thinking in the realm of projects that so many of us are engaged in, and of course we can discuss a lot how ill-suited a lot of the way that these projects are designed in the aid industry are to the problems that we're trying to tackle. But at the very basic level, I think from also the view of a fund that I work for, we are way too slow. It takes way too long to develop the kind of projects that we want to, if like these shorter, medium-term projects are supposed to have any value for some of the pressing issues, they take way too much time to develop. And of course, they rarely ever get at the longer-term structural things anyway. But we really need to change something there. And I think part of it is also then, again, within our institutions, whether that's NGOs or in particular the UN or governmental institutions or the AU, it's great how far a number of organizations have come. But with all the challenges that we're talking about, I do think we need the space for younger leaders that are more tech savvy, that have a different stake in a lot of the issues that we're talking about. But even within our own organization, it takes way too long for this next crop of leadership to rise up into positions where they can, have more influence in directing the organizations where they go. So I really think if we want to be more relevant on these issues, that is something we really have to deal with, some structural issues of how to make us better fit for purpose. And I think like looking at Ferdinand's comments, you know, I agree, if the UN is to be relevant in all of this, it has, I think, a real added value, but it needs to broker these partnerships and relationships. And of course, that means that you need to have people in countries that are able to do this. It's a very broad skill set, you know, that you need in order to broker these things, to be not just saying, well, I'm here to do what the member state wants. It's like, no, you're there to do a lot more because of the value system you're supposed to represent, but that is difficult to broker. And sure, we're starting to develop more tools like the community engagement guidelines that we recently developed in order to kind of get more away from just looking at our interactions with, you know, senior government representatives in a capital, but putting that into practice and brokering these spaces and basically convincing you know, also government stakeholders and member states that of course are sovereign, etc., but why it is in their interest to be more open and more inclusive in the longer run, right? It is also convincing them that a short-term, more authoritarian reaction to solve problems, most things that Pathways for Peace and other things told us will say, it's going to come back to bite you. But convincing them of that, again, is a skill set that is that we really need to, I think, be much more serious getting into the right places to be able to do so.
Great. And Victoria, you know, as you're listening to this, you know, what do you see as the kind of intersection with all the other sectors and the major leaps forward that humanity will make over the next 30 years that we need to be connecting with and taking advantage with to take our field forward into its next generation?
Yeah, maybe I like to go back to the element of partnerships that have been mentioned, because since the establishment of the Sustaining Peace Agenda in 2016, the international community has made progress on peace-building partnerships, and this should be recognized. We need to make sure that we do not lose sight of that and build innovation on top of it. The recent and very critical development is the development of the UN system-wide community engagement guidelines that Marcus has just mentioned, and the emergence of civil society, UN working and advisory groups in different contexts. Another critical development is the increased engagement of the Peacebuilding Commission and other UN peacebuilding partners with local civil society. This includes recent development of the action plan for the PBC's gender strategy and the new UNDP policy on youth. Another evidence of this was the participatory process of the 2020 Peacebuilding Architecture Review, where some civil society were not only able to engage in consultations, but also inform the global peacebuilding actors directly. And we have also seen the UN regional peacebuilding infrastructure taking shape and gaining more importance in sustaining peace. Our members of GPAC are more often able to build not only one-off connections, but systematic relationships with impact at the local level. And for example, this includes a project we have with UNDP in 5 regions, where our members highlight the value and critical impact of these consultations at the local level. And I think this is this partnership of UNDP and GPAC is an example of a partnership that enables partnerships at the regional level. However, it is only the beginning of what will bring impact. However, one point that stands out and that we need to take into consideration moving forward is that the international community needs to be able to measure progress on sustaining peace, and not only from the perspective of procedural changes, but from the perspective of impact at the local level. We need to really include local peace builders in assessment, monitoring, evaluation of what impact peacebuilding work has on the ground. For this to be done, we need to better unpack what meaningful and intentional partnerships and what funding for local peace builders look like, as Sam and Marcus mentioned. And coming back to your question, I want to reiterate that, yeah, we need to be doing a much better job bringing together, bringing the agenda together. And there is certainly a pushback against coherence and what is seen as lumping agendas together. However, we can build on existing mandates and be mindful of gaps between climate, peace building, development, humanitarian and human rights actions. And yeah, we really see the role of the Secretary General in guiding the multilateral systems towards more coherence. And I think I leave it here.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. You know, I mean, there are a lot of interesting and important points in this. One of them that I would pull out is the importance for us to have a shared understanding of what impacts we're seeking to cause, but having those really grounded in the realities of the lived lives of people facing conflict, so that the power and the agency to determine what success looks like rests there. And that's a really critical and difficult challenge, because the outcomes that we want to accomplish look very different from Colombia to to Sri Lanka, and to the lived realities of people. And so how we actually create an ability to actually understand that collectively is a really major challenge that we have, and that I know that a lot of academics are grappling with. So as we kind of go into our last round here, I want to just pull out one thing that has kind of emerged as a subtext here, which is about our scale of change. One of the fears that I have in these days about our field is that I feel that we have, how do I put this? There's a bit of a focus on peace writ small, to use CDA's language. And that we actually have a lot of accomplishments, on peace writ small. We have a lot of changes that we've been able to cause as a field. And I fear that we're abandoning the bigger vision of transforming conflict at scale, where conflict now is broadening in most places. Most of the most violent conflicts we're seeing have substantial transnational dimensions with international involvement. How do we hold true both to our understanding of how to cause change in people's lived realities at that local level, and cause change at scale, so that we're really truly transforming conflict systems? How do we do both of those things at the same time? If we're going to meet the challenge of the next decade and this huge array of challenges, or take advantage of this huge array of opportunities that we've just talked about, how do we actually do that? So I want to do this last round, and I want to ask each of you to think about, if there was one thing that you want to see this sector being in 2030, one major thing that you want to see us having taken that leap to accomplish, what would it be? Let me start with you, Sam.
Only one thing. That's going to be tough. Maybe I'll try to put it in 2 or 3.
One thing, and we have 7 minutes remaining, I've been told. 8 minutes remaining, I've been told. So one thing in 7 minutes or less at that.
I'll take up Vasu's challenge. This field and in the bubble, spreading out and doing and learning more. I think issues of I've learned quite a bit in being in the field. I am not an expert, but I've learned quite a bit about solar energy, water, electricity, sewage, local governance, etc., that maybe as a peace builder, I did not know so much about, but as a manager of a country office, I learned to appreciate much more. Issues of trade, business, cross-border, etc., we don't talk about so much. Issues of cities and corridors between them and rural areas, I think, are quite important. And then I think one important area that's coming up is sort of the behavioral insights, mental health, social support, better use of data, better understanding of the relationship between attitudes and behaviors will really help us quite a bit as well. Perfect. And maybe just one plug too for the capacities part. I think the next in the field is a much more spread in terms of the peace building cadre, broadly speaking, well beyond our peace and development advisors, into national capacities more and more, into better gender balances, into better linguistic balances, people who speak Arabic and French, and at this point, Portuguese is at a premium. So I think there are opportunities where we do more. And I think the bigger shift, if we are talking about the people that are important and some of the incentives behind our work and the scale that you talk about, Michael, this shift from funding to financing that necessarily relates to the private sector, the relationship with IFIs, the relationship with national counterparts, and the other sectors that need to be part and parcel of peace building, or a peace that is built and sustainable in 2030. I think that's really going to be critical. Over.
Fantastic. Victoria, one thing in a minute or less that you want to see this field take, one leap that you want to see us take?
I would say that intentional partnerships. We see that ad hoc engagement with local civil society produces little impact. The international community may take note of issues raised by civil society speakers. However, they will end up developing solutions that work for them. That's why we find initiatives like the community engagement guidelines so important, because it shifts the power and inspires local ownership and the commitment to peace building action in the long term, even from generation to generation, we could say. But we need to recognize that partnerships require resources and capacities. We need to stop talking only about capacity building. I think we need to build multilateral capacities to understand and engage with local peace builders. This requires financing that builds on local ownership, allocating time and capacities with the UN offices, of course.
So fantastic. Financed partnerships and vertical partnerships, which is what I really quite appreciate about what you're bringing, that it's not all about horizontal relationships, but about actually harnessing the power of vertical relationships. Marcus, one major leap that you want to see us take between now and 2030?
So, I mean, you were asking earlier about how do we get to the big, truly transformatory change of conflict systems, right? And then they're like the less of a leap, but rather the slow slog of the sort of, from an institutional perspective, of some of the visions we've tried to put in place. Because as we know, this still requires that we actually come around the same analysis that looks at a complex system, but that we derive our strategies from a common and shared analysis, right? Like even just starting off on the UN side of it, and the vision for that is there, the instruments for that are there, but I'd like to see it actually happen in the next 10 years. The leap for me is perhaps, if I had to choose one thing, because there's a lot for the sector about sort of how we become better on engaging on social media, that people that drive hate have become so good at, and that I think the peace building sector has a much to do. So that I think where I would like to see a really big thematic leap. Institutionally, for me, the leap would be to change our institutional incentives, because all of the stuff that we're talking about, the more systemic and the kind of things that as peace builders we would like to see, continues to be undermined by the incentives that so many of us have as agencies of how we raise money. And that we really need a leap if we want to change that.
Fantastic. Lavinia, one major leap by 2031, what would it be?
Well, coming from a network organization, I would say true networking where we're not focusing on reproducing action, but we're really harnessing the various, knowledge and learning that we all have. And so we can have the shared power, not just shifting power, but actually sharing power. And I think really the point about learning, which has already been made, horizontal learning, vertical learning. And I think that's one of the key things I think we really need to take on seriously, and not just focus on reproducing action and competing for funding, And so again, the point about financing also becomes important within the context of networking. And so that we can all look at how we are financing, not focusing on just getting funding, but really using our various types of resources to achieve the bigger picture and bigger shifts that we want to see.
Fantastic. Vasu, you have the last word here. One major.
Okay, so I see Femi's long shadow there. So I'm going to try to quickly get in here and say, look, I mean, Michael, a big shift, and I'm going to give you a big shift. If you want to transform conflict, you have to transform society. There's no other way to do this. And what we've done is we've established, as you know, we've established global peace as an entity. And Lavinia, you remember in May of 2019, we came to Ghana, and together with the president of Ghana, who's the SDG co-chair advocates, and Graça Michel, the chair of our board, we launched the intergenerational dialogues, and we promised to do 100 dialogues in 100 cities. In January this year, we finished 100 dialogues in 100 cities, from, you know, from Yokohama to Accra to Delhi to everywhere. We did these dialogues, would really, really energized young people and their city officials. And then we brought all of this on the 5th of March to the United Nations, where the DSG and Graça Michel jointly convened the global dialogue with all of these young people. So I don't know, 300-400 of them came together, all leaders, and we launched the Futures Forum. What is the Futures Forum? Now, this is the big thing. You know, these young people will work over the next 2 years, and they are coming up with what Graça Michel calls our ecosystem for development. They will bring influencers together. These are city officials, innovators, who's the young people who will innovate in the things that Sam talked about, electricity and water, et cetera, and then we are approaching social impact investors, the big social impact investors, to invest in those innovations, and then working with implementers like UNDP officers on the ground and others to implement this. So this is the big thing. We indicated also at that launch of the Futures Forum that in 2025, we will mobilize 5 million members, and we have a 3-part strategy: mobilization, conscientization, organization. So we're in the mobilization phase. We're also conscientizing young people with the Futures Forum. And in 2025, we will launch this at a global conference with 5 million members, you know, somewhere in the world. We haven't decided where that will be, but that's transforming the world. Thank you very much.
Vasu, thank you. And thank you for laying out that vision. There's lots more to say, as there always is. And I just want to thank all of you. This has been really interesting. I so regret that we're not all going out to lunch together now to be able to continue this and maybe debate it all further. What a fascinating group of people. And I really honor all of you. You're doing amazing work. And it's just a privilege to have a chance to be amongst you today. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, panel. You can have a virtual break, maybe not a virtual lunch, but a virtual break together. That's coming up in just a little while. This is Prevention in Action, a global forum convened by the UNDP for the very first time in 2021. There are 6 big sessions. The next big session will be about peace building and conflict prevention, but from the perspective of the private sector. What role do they have? I will let you mull that over during our break. You have 10 minutes to get up, stretch your legs, enjoy your time away from your screen. And then when you come back, we'll be looking at the private sector. And while you're on your break, do look out for the polls and the engagement that we're doing with you on your screen. And I will see you in 10 minutes' time.
Thank you. Sam, are you still there?
Yes, Vasu, right here. I think.
I'm sorry, sorry, Assistant Administrator. I would have loved to stay, Sam. You know, I'm preparing to travel to Juba and Khartoum, you know, where it's still involved in the peace process there. between SPLM North and the government. So, you know, I'm in the middle of preparing for that, and unfortunately I have to leave your conference.
No problem. Thank you so much for joining us, Vasu. Always a pleasure with you and all of the colleagues. And I think now most colleagues online know your itinerary as well. So if you're in
Juba, well, you know, it's an open itinerary.
Thank you so much, Vasu. Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Sam. Take care. Bye.
Hello, welcome back everybody. This is the Prevention in Action Global Forum 2021 convened by the UNDP. It's the inaugural forum. There will be many more going into the future. I am Femi Oke. I am your facilitator, but I am not your moderator. That job goes to important people. I'm here just to introduce them. I'm going to say hello to Joseph de Cruz. Joseph, hello, so nice to see you. This man has so much knowledge in his head. It's extraordinary. Joseph de Cruz is the Special Advisor for Strategic Planning and Innovation to the Administrator, UNDP. You are his special person. What does that mean that you do exactly?
Oh dear. Fix problems, run errands, fetch coffee, the usual. And in between that, also work with our team to help try and chart the course of where we need to go as an organization. You know, we work with a lot of different issues. So there's a lot of thinking and experimentation around where we need to go in the future.
Joseph, when I saw this session was happening in the Global Forum for Prevention in Action, I did a double take. The private sector in prevention of conflict and peace building. I can't wait for you to get this session started. I'm handing it over to you. I know it's in good hands.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Femi. It's a real pleasure to be here. And welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see so many familiar faces on the screen as well. And in this session, we want to switch, as Femi said, to looking at an interesting dimension of the partnerships conversation that the previous session picked up on, which is the growing partnership and presence of the private sector, the business world, in peace and prevention. We have an interesting session set up today, kicking off with an introductory set of comments by our colleague, Luis Felipe Lopez-Calva, the Assistant Administrator and Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and our Regional Director for Latin America. We'll have Luis Felipe make some introductory comments first, then I'll switch over to introducing and engaging with the panel that we have lined up today. So without further ado, Luis Felipe, over to you.
Thank you very much, JD. I assume you can hear me well, otherwise you will let me know. Thank you, everybody, particularly thank you to our colleagues in the Crisis Bureau, the global team for this excellent panel and for the great opportunity to discuss these issues, and of course to Didier Tadesse and Firsam Hashim, and we will have time to discuss this issue. But I wanted to give you two main messages and a third aspect that is more like how we think in Latin America and the Caribbean about this issue, particularly in the context. I cannot avoid relating it also to the COVID-19 situation, great crisis we're going through. So in general, the issue we're discussing today is strictly related to what we can call broadly governance, in the sense of the mechanisms through which state and non-state actors interact to reach and sustain agreements. These agreements can be policies, these agreements can be rules, can be laws. So really the setup in which these agreements are reached and sustained is what we call governance. And in many cases, and I have to say, particularly the region where I work, Latin America and the Caribbean, is the most violent region in the world, even though we don't have a war. So in that sense, this is very important. We contribute with about 35% of homicides per year, violent deaths, even though we only have 9% of the population in the world. So let's put it in the context of this broad concept of governance. So certainly the way we address the issue of private sector, how the private sector can contribute to close or to bridge structural development deficits that are really important to be tackled if we are to sustain peaceful societies. So we, in a way, the COVID-19 situation has basically made evident structural deficits that were already there. And in many cases, they are being deepened. Some of these gaps are being deepened by the current crisis. And this is what we have called in recent publications, a situation where juncture meets structure. The idea to reinforce the fact that the pandemic has interacted with structural challenges in the region, exacerbating its impact. But as a preamble to the three messages I want to give you, I want to say that UNDP has a mandate to support socioeconomic recovery of the countries in this context of the COVID-19, and has developed a series of socioeconomic impact analysis in Latin America and the Caribbean. But one particular aspect in which we have worked is a document that we call Latin America and the Caribbean, Effective Governance Beyond Recovery. And this is a process in which we consulted with close to 100 very important leaders in the region to come up with a series of ideas on how to build more effective governance to construct peaceful societies after we recover from this severe crisis. And in that context, the private sector plays a fundamental role. So in terms of private sector specifically, I think the core responsibility of the private sector in the construction of the new, improved, and more inclusive sense of normality, I would say first message is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course I have a bias because this is the region where I work, the COVID-19 has shown a systematic situation that we can call a crisis of inclusion and rights, the denial of rights. It has in some places exacerbated inequalities, discrimination, and the risk of institutional violence. While the response to COVID-19 has led to the adoption of emergency measures worldwide to address the crisis, the defense of the rule of law has to be strengthened to protect people's rights and access to resources, which also creates a better space for private sector to flourish, but one in which also the private sector has a very important role to play. 34 million jobs have been lost in this crisis in 2020 as a result of this pandemic. How are we going to recover from this? Only if micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises recover, and they represent about 60% of total employment in the region. So this is a very important role, how to help the private sector reestablish normal economic conditions that can only be driven by the private sector. The second message is that once, we have a robust rule of law, then this enables conditions for these agreements, as I said before, to be sustained. So what we call institutions, which are these agreements among people, among actors, businesses and citizens can be consensus on in some cases, the new rules of the game to ensure that the full exercise of human rights and the achievement of sustainable development is actually made possible. We have some political compromises and commitments that are required for this. One is to think of a development model that is sustainable in the sense of the responsible consumption, responsible production. Second one that has the capacity to ensure the inclusion of a rights-based approach in private sector, in companies, and I will talk about this in a moment. And the other is how the region, with a very high level of informality and where taxes are neglected, can opt in the social contract by contributing to the creation of public goods precisely by contributing fiscally and in other ways for this purpose. I think the Human Development Report 2020 on human development and the Anthropocene also discusses very, very clearly and in depth many aspects on the fact of I will mention two elements. One is nature-based solutions and changes in social norms in which the private sector can support this equilibrium in which peaceful agreements among actors are sustained. So basically what happens is, in our region at least, is that violence continues to be an instrument, either violence or the threat of violence continues to be an instrument to sustain and reach agreements among actors. This is the fundamental structural problem. I think the very specific initiatives that we have with the private sector can help build peaceful societies from the very local level. I think this is very important, that what we call it in a recent paper that we published, proximity structures. Private sector can in a way be represented as a network of proximity structures in which people interact. And the private sector has a very important role in terms of protection of human rights and social rights that can help in that direction. UNDP, for example, supports human rights due diligence and COVID-19 based on rapid self-assessments for businesses, in which precisely the idea is to help businesses consider and manage human rights impacts on their own operations. So in a way, bringing this idea of the construction of sustainable peace at a very local level. So these rapid assessments are offered to companies as a way, not the only one, but as a way to inform the actions with a human rights lens, and to also educate actors in terms of, international agreements and international conventions related to these matters. I also want to mention an initiative that is emerging called SOFIA, which we have supported jointly with OFI. It's really an OFI initiative, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, of the construction of MPI, multidimensional poverty indices, at the business level. So you actually can help firms construct multidimensional poverty indices for their own employees. And then you set basically standards, and you set goals in terms of how to improve in terms of the reduction of the multidimensional poverty for their own employees and their communities. And I think this is a very interesting initiative precisely because of what I'm saying. These are proximity structures. So it is not really led by the state, but it's actually proximity structures in which individuals and their communities can be part of that effort, led fundamentally by private sector, but of course enabled by public policy, but led by private sector, in order to create dynamics of local development that can lead to a more sustainable peace at the very local level. So there are many ways I see in which the private sector can play this role. UNDP is certainly exploring ways and experimenting in ways in which this can be done. But fundamentally, what I want to leave here is this idea that governance has to be very well specifically designed as these mechanisms that state and non-state actors have to interact to reach agreements to sustain them. And we want to make sure that those do not involve violence or the threat of violence, or we can rebalance what we can call power asymmetries in those interactions, so that the agreements are inclusive and the societies are respectful of human rights and are more prosperous as well. Just ending with the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown old comment that, as he said, when implementing the rule of law, the first 5 centuries are always the hardest. So this is a constant battle that we have to give, and UNDP is here to support those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis Felipe. And indeed, the Gordon Brown quote reminds us that our usual project intervention durations are probably slightly inadequate as a frame in which to try and capture the kind of societal transformations you're talking about there. Really interesting. And as you said, as a perspective from a region that has a high degree of violence even without wars, I think it speaks a lot to the underlying governance challenges that we deal with so often when we're working on peace and prevention issues. And I particularly liked the approach or the frame you presented about businesses in the business sector as proximity structures through which actions can be taken on the ground to be able to strengthen resilience, reduce vulnerability, and reduce the possibility of conflict. And that's an idea I think I'll take into the conversation with our panel. So let me now introduce two people I have in our panel with us today. Firstly, great pleasure to introduce Lidette Tades-Schifferow, who is Policy Officer at the European Center for Development Policy Management. And Lidette's recently been authored a book on scoping private sector engagement in conflict prevention and peace building that we'd like to talk about a little bit more. And also from the other end of the world, Firzan Hashim, who's the Sri Lanka Country Director for the Asia Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management. Hash, really great to have you with us. I know that the Alliance is a transnational platform that coordinates work across governments, the private sector, and NGOs in humanitarian crises. And looking forward to hearing a little bit your experience as well of how this has happened in a number of the crises that have occurred in Sri Lanka. We were actually meant to be joined by a third panelist, Carol Kariuki Karuga, who is the CEO of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. And I was really looking forward to talking to her about the role that KEPSA plays in things like the Kenyan electoral processes. Unfortunately, it seems that for logistical reasons, Carol hasn't been able to join us today. But I'm sure the two of you will have more than enough interesting thoughts to kick off a conversation here. So, Lidette, let me start with you. As I mentioned, you recently produced or led the development of this publication on private sector engagement in conflict prevention and peace building. So what came out as the main entry point for businesses and the private sector who are interested in engaging in peace building? And did you come across anything in that work that surprised you? What are the things that you would actually have as takeaways for people about how to engage with the private sector?
Thank you very much, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you to take part in this discussion. And excellent questions there as well. I was really fascinated by those questions. So on the first one, on the entry points, what I have seen from the literature is that there are two major entry points for involving the private sector. And the previous speaker has also sort of alluded to them. So the two entry points, one is in conflict prevention. And then the other one is in post-conflict reconstruction, or let's say maybe sustaining peace is the more appropriate term. So in conflict prevention, when it comes to peace campaigns or financing mediation and reconciliation processes, or sometimes even partaking in preventive diplomacy when formal processes for diplomacy are not opportune, say because some conflicting parties are not accessible, or when you don't have an actor that could sort of convene very different and conflicting parties, the private sector could be a key actor there. So in conflict prevention, that is one entry point. And it's unfortunate that we don't have Carol because in Kenya, for example, with peace campaigns, we do have the example where the private sector stepped in. The second point in sustaining peace or in post-conflict reconstruction, the primary role there would be for the private sector to assist in kickstarting the economy after conflict or violent conflict has occurred. But processes such as rebuilding infrastructure, service delivery, these are places or spaces where the private sector could have positive and constructive roles. What did I find interesting from the study? I think the one aha moment for me was that much of the literature on what we know about the private sector can and has engaged in conflict prevention and peace building was actually written by peace builders. So the voice of the private sector itself was sort of missing from the literature and from this discussion. So we don't really know why the private sector, from their point of view, and at times where they have engaged, why they have engaged, how they have engaged, how do they even understand their role in conflict prevention and peace building? What do they see in it for them, and how do they conceptualize it? That we don't know a lot about. So that I found was interesting. But I also believe understanding this dimension, understanding part of the explanation from their side of from their point of view, I think is what we need to basically sort out or understand in order to move forward in discussing the role of the private sector in peace building. On what are the basically takeaways for peace builders in engaging the private sector, there are maybe 3 things that I would say. One is, do not take the possibility or the merit of private sector engagement in conflict prevention and peace building for granted, meaning it's not always that the private sector has a constructive role. So this is very contextual. It depends on the context. It depends on the perceived and real legitimacy of the private sector itself. It depends on when exactly you're going to involve them, so the timing, but also the level or depth of involvement. So it really does depend on the context at hand, and we shouldn't really automatically assume that the private sector is a positive player in all conflict settings. Here, another dimension is to not also overlook the fact that private sector engagement in peace building has a bit of a normative angle to it. And while we shouldn't really be bogged down by the normative aspect, we shouldn't also overlook the fact that it has a normative aspect to it. And eventually, we have to understand that peace is a public good, and it is the responsibility of everyone to contribute to peace. And it is also the duty, the primary duty bearer to provide peace is the government. Now, this doesn't mean the government is the only actor that should then engage in providing peace as a public good, but we shouldn't just overlook these factors as well. The second point is, there's really no good recipe for how to engage the private sector in a positive manner. It relates to what I said earlier. It is very contextual. But perhaps what would be a helpful way of looking at it is maybe looking at degrees of or levels of private sector engagement. This relates to what Felipe was saying earlier. At a minimum, we should make sure that they do not cause harm. So we should make sure that at least they have the conflict analysis in place, that they operate in a way is conflict sensitive. So this is, like at the minimum, the do no harm principle needs to be in place. And the second degree of involvement would be to have the private sector be involved in creating enabling conditions for peace. So this is where they come in employment creation and infrastructure, revenue generation for the government as well, because this relates to service delivery, legitimacy, all of those things. And the third one is we can, as I said, also consider direct involvement of the private sector in peace building processes, but cautiously. Yeah? So we have to really investigate if the conditions are ripe for that. And the third and final point I think is a takeaway is, in all of these documented cases of what we know the private sector to have contributed, what we see is the private sector does better when working under associations or alliances, much more so than when you have one private sector or two private sector actors being involved in peace building processes. And this is particularly true if we're talking about mediation or politically sensitive sort of peace building processes. Then it is better to engage the private sector, the private sector alliances or associations than specific private sector actors. And this has to do with legitimacy questions and all. So perhaps these are the points that I think I would say are takeaway points from my study.
Brilliant, thank you. I actually really resonated with the first point you made about so much of the literature being generated from the perspective of people from the peace building community rather than from the business sector. And I think that's sometimes a systemic problem across the whole development humanitarian peace building world, that we spend far too much time thinking about what we want from other actors, rather than genuinely putting ourselves in their shoes and thinking about how can we make an effective case for them to engage in a way that makes sense for them as much as it does for us. I'll come back to a couple of the other things you said, because I also want, when we get into the discussion, I think, to talk about potentially some of the challenges when you have large dominant business actors in contexts that are fragile, where, as Luis Felipe alluded to just now, they're weak governance structures, and how those could also be, in some cases, a destabilizer of societies and peace structures. But before I get to that, let me bring Harsh into the conversation as well. So Harsh, can you tell us a bit about APAD's role in Sri Lanka, particularly after the Easter bombing, but also more generally in terms of how, as an alliance, you're working to support peace and resilience in Sri Lanka, and your own thoughts on how the role that the private sector can play, particularly in a highly complex context like Sri Lanka's. Over to you.
Thank you, Joseph, and greetings from Sri Lanka. Picking from what Lidet said with regards to peace, conflict prevention, peacekeeping, peace building, the primary role or the responsibility lies with the government. But everybody has to be a partner to it, and the private sector certainly can be a partner where we can complement through their operations and the interventions in terms of supporting the social cohesion and stability. The key criteria for partnerships, if not for successful engagement, is acceptance and trust. I think in this case, where we need to figure out is there was a study done by the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer, which rates the business sector as the most trusted by the public above the governments, NGOs, and the media. Why not make use of that trust which has been put upon on the private sector itself? See, companies are part of societies. I think we need to understand, if we are to drive change, it has to be localized. There has to be local ownership. It also has to come from within that particular area, from within that region. And this is where a private sector is integrated into the society. If you see the private sector access, they do have access to areas where even the UN or the others cannot go in during a crisis, whether it is immediate or complex emergency or so on. So there is a time lag even for the others to come into the scenario. So private sector is always on the same. How can we make use of them? In other terms also we have seen, that is APAD is headquartered in Japan, but has 6 country representation in the Asia Pacific region. In addition to that, we have the CBI itself, which has 13 global networks around the world. So we have seen these where the private sector becomes the first responders during a crisis. So they are first responders, they are on ground. And we have seen this many a times. And Joseph, you asked about what happened in Sri Lanka during the Easter bombing in 2019. And you would know that we had in a 30-year conflict, which came to an end in 2009. And then 10 years later, we see these 6 bombings in the churches and the hotels, which just came up during the Easter Sunday in 2019. There again, there was chaos as soon as it happened. There was tensions in relations to ethnicity, ethnic tensions, religious tensions, but people needed help, especially far east, where Batticaloa, there was a church which was bombed, and there were so many children and families which were affected. There was no way the humanitarian sector could reach out to the people because they were concerned about their safety and security. And they used our platform. What was our platform? Platform which brings the private sector on board, connect them with the UN, the NGOs, and the governments. So we had a MOU with the largest supermarket chain, where they would be delivering food and non-food items or pharmaceuticals or so on during a crisis. So the agencies came to us and said, can we use your platform? We need to deliver these items to so and so in those particular areas. And we did that. And the private sector went door to door to those homes and delivered. So that's the strength of the private sector that you see. They have a supermarket chain, the chain where it can reach out anywhere. And when you also look at the private sector, it has different workers with them. They have workers related to different cultures, different ethnicity, different religions, and so on. So in this context, what we saw was how much the private sector can get involved immediately, also in the long term. We had the HSBC coming after, just after the aftermath of the bombing, and they said, we want to work with you in supporting the families. And their funding did not stop at the immediate level of whether it was education, if not for medicine, no. It was long term. They said, we want to come in for reconciliation, for psychosocial activities, to ensure that there is harmony among communities. So that's how the private sector would want to work. But you need to create that trust to work with them and have to have that particular partnership in ensuring that it becomes very effective. Okay, what is the role the private sector can play? There is quite a lot that, as Lidet also mentioned, quite a massive role that they could play. So you see the engine of growth itself, economy. 90% of the jobs are generated by the private sector. Over 60% investments by the private sector. The government gets its revenue, 80%, from the private sector. Then you see about the employment. And again, Lidet spoke about that employment. How you can create the social cohesion. You would have so many people from so many areas coming under one roof. Otherwise, they would not be meeting them and then understanding each other. There itself, you could reach out to so many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands within a roof. The youth could be reached out. How can we approach them? Then the neutrality that they possess. The neutrality, why that can be an influencer in peace building itself. The inclusive business, how could we ensure that women are included in the decision-making process? How can we incorporate that into the private sector? Then support micro enterprises, then minority-owned businesses in circumstances where we are having issues related to ethnicity and religious conflicts. Then advocacy. I think advocacy, private sector has a very strong advocacy strength. They can influence policy, whether the policy is related to indiscrimination policy, if not to support the minorities, if not to ensure that there is a flow of goods from A to B without any issues related to area, ethnicity, or religious issues related to that. Then the partnerships for prevention. See, one of the importance you are talking about partnership for prevention. How can the private sector be a partner with the UN, with the NGOs, with the INGOs? There is a nexus that could be created with them. And through this partnership, you can reach out to many on ground and also ensure that the policy also is influenced through advocacy. In these cases, what you can do together is address root causes. These are the issues which continue to probe and fester. So the root causes need to be sorted out. Then negate the triggers of conflict. What happens? It can be related to water wars. I mean, we are having issues here, even in Sri Lanka. But then identify together what are the issues which would come in, where you can sort it out earlier, and then also get the people discuss and have these discussions. There was quite a lot of experiences that we had. So due to time that I would not want to explain more about it. But again, I would like to insist on the engagement of the private sector. They need to be engaged, but also, again, Lidet spoke about it, the do no harm approaches, conflict sensitive business practices. Then also look beyond that. Let it be peace positive. Can they look at a peace positive approach? How can they work in terms of bringing peace while they are doing their businesses as well? So these are areas that needs to be looked at. But one of the key importance is how would you engage them? You cannot engage them individually, no. But this is where we have created those platforms, networks. These networks have to have the credibility. They need to have the credibility in working with all agencies, all stakeholders. So make use of them. Lidet actually mentioned about that as well. Don't go solo, but work with these organization networks. We have already set up networks in Sri Lanka. The CBI has set up networks so much in the global arena, 13 networks. Then APAD has its 6 networks in the Asia Pacific region. So ensure that, like Sri Lanka and the rest of the countries institutionalized DRR, I'm sure peace building also can be institutionalized into the private sector. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Harsh. Listen, a lot in what both of you have laid out there that I think we'll want to unpack. And I will keep a close eye on time, and Monica will ping me as we start getting questions in the Q&A we need to respond to as well. But let me try and pull a few of these threads together and then see where we can push the conversation. Clearly, there is tremendous potential for the private sector and for businesses to engage in peace and prevention. They have, I think, Harsh, as you mentioned from the Edelman Trust Barometer, a very high degree of trust in many parts of the world, in many cases, often even exceeding governments, NGOs, and others. They have capacities, service delivery, logistics, the ability to respond. They have networks on the ground, which both provide that logistical capacity, but also the information networks and the social networks that allow them to reach into places like Batikola that governments and others often cannot. So it's pretty clear there is a need or an opportunity there for the business sector to play a role in peace and prevention. That's evident from what you've said so far. But let's talk a little bit more about how we make the case to business leaders and to the private sector about the value or the need for them to engage in these actions. Now, to start off the conversation, I would throw one out, which is, generally speaking, the business sector values stability. That in order for them to operate, they actually need societies, environments, economies that are functioning in a stable and safe way. So there is a kind of a bottom line imperative for them as well to ensure that they have the space to operate. But beyond that, when you are speaking to business leaders, when you're speaking to business coalitions about this issue, how do you make the pitch to convince them to really invest time and money and effort and financial resources in this kind of work? Lidet, maybe you want to go first, and I'll turn to Harsh after that.
Yeah, I'll keep mine short because I think Hashim can respond to this from experience as well. But in my findings from the research, the thing that I found interesting was that there was a report produced by speaking to different business owners. And it's interesting because in their minds, what they're doing is problem solving. It's not even necessarily, oh, we're contributing to like this public good. I mean, there is indeed that aspect of it when we're talking about violent conflict. But the other aspects of how they end up contributing to conflict prevention and peace building is because as part of their operation, problem solving is what they do on the daily. And this is part of how they conceptualize their contributions to peace building as well. So that I found interesting. But maybe Hashim, especially when the business case for contributing to peace building is not always clear, at least in the short term, it would be interesting to see how they rationalize it.
Lidet, hold on one second. I'm not going to let you off so easily because I have a follow-up question for you. You talked very rightly about the culture of the business world being, problem solving. And so a lot of the approach offered in these contexts is, we know how to solve problems, we'll jump in there, we'll solve it. Do you sometimes find, though, that there's a risk that they underestimate the complexity of the problem when they come into this? Just a quick follow-up question to you before I move on to Hashim.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, it depends on the context, because in some contexts, these businesses have actually been there for ages. So there is some like in-depth knowledge of what the conflict structure is, who the actors are. And in some ways, they're actually far more informed of the informal operations of power, more so than peace builders are, because peace builders sometimes tend to look at the formal constellation of power, whereas the businesses also understand the informal constellations of power and conflict. So in that way, some of them do understand what it is, what the situation is like. But in some ways, it is also indeed possible that they underestimate the complexity of the situation, and that in a way, if you're looking at such a complex system and such a politically also charged system as just a problem-solving exercise, it's also likely that you would only solve it from a technical point of view and not necessarily from a transformational point of view. And this is where the partnership from governments who have, the duty to actually make these things transformational, or from peace builders who also have that conviction to bring about this transformational change, could sort of complement the business sector, the private sector's problem-solving approach. There, maybe that's where you bring in the complementarities.
I love the complementarity point. Hashim, what do you think?
Yes, Joseph. I think when you deal with the private sector, it's about win-win situation. What do you get? What do they get? I think under the current circumstances, you see the pandemic itself. It has caused so much of chaos, so much of loss of jobs, the income losses. Would the private sector want to have so many other losses with intersecting disasters anymore? I mean, so that's where we also need to understand how can we enable an environment for them also to engage. So understanding that, now see, for example, the issues that we had in Sri Lanka and even in other countries, when the aftermath of the Easter bombing itself, there was this issue against the Muslims. And people said, we will not buy anything from the shops, Muslim-owned shops, or produce from the Muslims. But who loses? The whole chain. I mean, if one person does not supply, whether it is SME or whether it is a larger company, there is no flow and everybody loses in the long run. So the private sector does not want to do that. And if you look at the larger companies in Sri Lanka, which are Muslim-owned, they realized that they need to be impartial. They need to ensure that peace building, if not conflict resolution or whatever, is incorporated into a system. And there is a real case study of a large apparel company in Sri Lanka, which is owned by a Muslim-owned company, but they were perfect. The governance was so good. And the people who were working with them from other religions or ethnicities said, no, don't do that. These people are doing so very well and they take care of us and the communities and so on. So I think there is quite a lot of areas where the business sector does not want to lose anymore, and how much of support that they can get from the experts like you, and how they at a particular time like this, they would welcome you. And you see the youth are all going into the private sector. And they need to be ensured that they are in the right path. They are the guys who can be immediately, taken out of a path, and then they can be radicalized into a lot of areas. But here again, whilst we also work with faith-based organizations, it is also important that we bring in the peace-building component into the private sector. And when you asked about how are they willing to accept, yes, certainly, because we have gone through enough. We have gone through enough, and we need to have stability. Only if there is stability, there would be livelihood. And if you do not ensure that there is no recovery or growth for the private sector, we are going to go into conflict once over again, not only here, but in the region itself.
Right. And I'm not only seeing myself so many threads here we need to follow, I'm getting messages to my colleagues going, oh my goodness, she just made a wonderful point. Could you pick up on that again? So let me pick up on one of those and I come back to you, Lidette. You mentioned in passing just now that issue of understanding of local context and how sometimes on the one hand, you have businesses that are very situated in their local societies and communities that may have a very deep understanding of context that is useful for those of us from the outside coming in. Or conversely, you may have situations where there's businesses that perhaps only operate at a global or regional level and do the risk of coming in and doing harm because in taking a problem-solving approach, they don't really understand the local context. So to tease out, and this is a question for both of you, Harsh, particularly in terms of your own experience, where you see good examples of people in our sector being able to capitalize on the local knowledge and context knowledge of the business sector. How do we get better at doing that? How do we build a platform so that sharing of contextual knowledge actually informs our work as much as theirs? Lidette?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. And I think something that you touched on at the onset as well. And indeed, when we talk about the role of the private sector on the negative aspect of the conflict setting, their understanding of informal constellations of power could go either way. And then how do we as peace builders make sure that that energy is either controlled and regulated, or that it is diverted towards a positive end? I think there perhaps we can talk about legal enforcement mechanisms, or the legal sector, and whether or not you have sufficient laws in place. But as you rightfully said, in some conflict-affected settings, either you don't have these laws, or even if you do have these laws, then enforcement is quite weak. So what do you do in these cases? One thing you could do is, if there's a private, vibrant civil society sector, then those civil society organizations could do some part of, creating pressure. But then the other thing that could also be done is, right now, if a business, for example, commits some sort of atrocities or human rights violations in one context, there is a potential that that message could go not only to their consumers in that specific context, but also globally. So in a sense, the local becoming global, there is potential that you can also exert pressure and enforce or incentivize positive business practices from a global point of view as well. So consumers at the local level have some power, but also consumers and the business, the whole ecosystem at the global level, there is some role to be played. But the other thing is, though, and again, this relates to what the role of the government should also be. I think part of the assistance in galvanizing private sector for peace building should also be invested in supporting government capacity for law enforcement, supporting government capacity to put in place regulations that do not constrain the private sector, but that do not also allow the private sector to be, like the central actor in these settings. So it's not an easy balance to forge, but it is one that must be discussed and put in place. And maybe just one more point that I wanted to add to what Hashim was saying. The other incentive for private sector is, as I say now, these certification programs, and the fact that now your audience is international and it's not just local is one incentive and disincentive. And then the other one is, interestingly, for some companies, there's also an organizational legacy. So some companies have had this legacy, 50 years, 100 years of giving back to the community. So sometimes it's also by tapping into that legacy that they actively contribute to peace building processes. So sometimes we can also tap into, like how they see themselves as an organization, how they see themselves as a part of society. So that's also one approach to try.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting what you said. I think you're bringing out a key point where there's obviously neither an either or, that the private sector can only engage effectively in these contexts when there is a certain sort of a governance structure, societal systems within which they can operate in a positive way. And there are certainly many negative examples of places where a predominant private sector presence without good governance can actually exacerbate conflict. And we see this so much in mineral-rich contexts, Sierra Leone, Papua New Guinea, you name it. So I know there's a discussion there about that dimension as well, but I'm going to park that because I also want to pick up a little bit, Lidet. You were talking about, values. And turning back to Hashim, when we reach out to the private sector, obviously there is both an argument, a pitch that can be made on a purely kind of incentive point of view. It is in your interest to engage in peace building here. And then there's the normative value-driven thing of it's the right thing to do. In your experience, and I know it's going to be context specific and I know it's not either or, but what works best or what works better in how we present this to the private sector? Do we lead with the values and then talk about bottom line, or do you start with bottom line and then bring in also the value proposition?
See, Joseph, there is always a reputational risk in partnerships. And you would also see it both ways. they are also, private sector is also worried about their brands. And
Yeah.
as you know, how the others would perceive. And then it can affect their businesses if it is not done in the right way. One of the key areas here, I mean, like when we also started this concept, CBI and the APAC, is private sectors are very cautious. Private sector companies, they're very, very cautious. It is about even engaging with the government. They do not want to engage with the government directly because it will lead to political issues, or if they would say they would want donations, or if we do not give the donations, it might, you know, we might not get authority and so on, the usual issues. So this is where the network comes into the scenario, where this platform would be a conduit or a buffer. How could we, like with the UN, with the other agencies, get together and be that effective conduit and the buffer, where we basically sort out the misunderstandings A and B has. Once the trust is built, you know, the sky is the limit, because we have seen that. We have seen that the private sector is initially very cautious, but the moment they know whom they are dealing with, they would. See, in peace building and in providing support or giving back. Now, in the Manic Farm, I'm sure you guys must be knowing about the Manic Farm, the largest camp or second largest camp in the world. So we had more than 400,000 people in one particular area. In that, we saw the private sector coming in, and they said, okay, we will work with you. We will give you the seedlings. You do the farming, and we will buy back from you. But as you very rightly said, they need to be governed. They need to be ensured that what they say, they deliver. This is where, in addition to platforms like us, you would also find the chambers of commerce. Now, see, the difference between the chambers of commerce and us, we are only looking at the disaster management, whether it is human-induced or natural. But in their case, it's about governance itself, and they are answerable. The chambers would be answerable, and also the private sector would be answerable. And you can take them to courts, if not the state, if not cancel their license, and also ensure that they don't work. So these are the checks and balances which are required. But I'm sure that under the current context, like we are promoting DRR or institutionalizing, these are areas they are looking at, because there's so much more, whether it is disasters or otherwise, there are so much of disruptions, interruptions to businesses. And they are looking at positives as to how they can be more preventive rather than being reactive. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting what you both said about private sector businesses often not wanting to act alone in this space, but being a lot more comfortable acting through coalitions, through chambers, through platforms. And perhaps one of the key roles that organizations and sectors like ours can play is to create those platforms, those coalitions that allow private sectors actors to act in a way that doesn't feel as risky. In fact, Sam Risk posted a comment in the chat talking about, do we have a role, we as the UN and other actors in the space, to kind of de-risk the potential actions of private sector actors in these places, whether it's in prevention, peacekeeping, etc. And perhaps one immediate way by which we help de-risk that is by creating these platforms that allow them to act. Now, I cannot believe this, but I'm already getting messages from the team going, we have 3 minutes left. So I think I'm looking at my wrong watch clearly, but I'm going to very quickly now check in also with Monica and the team who are sending me messages on the chat and see whether there are any other questions that came up that we haven't touched on. I think we covered a lot of this, but maybe a question, and again, Lida, I'll start with you on this one. You know, we touched a little bit on the situations where a predominant private sector actor, a major mining company or something like that, can actually be a destabilizer and in some respects a creator of conflict. In those situations, then, how do we approach that? I mean, what are in your experience, and Hashim, yours as well, you know, what can we do to engage with large actors like that and try and create the environment, the conditions, the coalition of actors around that to be able to reduce conflict?
Yeah, I think those are like the difficult nuts to crack, right? Also because in these contexts, the private sector is also affiliated with politics. So the private sector is not just operating from a market point of view, but oftentimes have some sort of connection to conflicting parties to make sure that they stay in their operation. So then, you know, the economy or the market becomes political itself. So I would say in these circumstances, the solution would also have to be political sort of engagement. And it is in these circumstances where you also need the naming and shaming part of civil society action. It is in these contexts where you see active peace builders that are actually watching out for what these actors are doing, and then trying to also engage in advocacy to make sure to either lessen the kind of impact that they are having in the conflict system, but also hopefully using legal means or political means as well, make sure to minimize the impact they have. And this, for me, relates to why I began my takeaway points by saying we shouldn't always assume that the private sector would play a constructive role in peace building or in conflict settings. So we should, that's why my response to Sam would be, I wouldn't say it's a no. So I wouldn't say we should never de-risk, but I would also say not so easy. We shouldn't also completely de-risk their role. So really depends on the context.
Femi, I know you came in to tell us that we've got plenty of time left and we can continue this conversation because it feels
Keep going for the next 6 hours, no problem. I am saying this is your final words. Because also, I'm sure all of you would agree that it's the action that counts rather than the dialogue. So you inspire us to go off and do the action, to actually walk the talk, because you've given us an excellent talk. Joseph, how do you want to wrap up?
Oh, goodness. And actually, Hush, I'm going to come back to you just to also have a last word before I do wrap up. If you want to take like 30 seconds or a minute for any last pieces of advice you give us, tricks of the trade, how do we get better at engaging with the business sector? And Femi, I'll be very brief myself.
Yeah. See, it's about, on the last question that you asked, it's about advocacy. It also is about engaging with the communities. The civil society can be a massive strength in terms of how they can advocate and how we can support them. The private sector needs to be regulated for sure, but we also have to see the possibilities that they could bring, but then looking at the do no harm concept as well. In short, I think the private sector has all the guys who are there, the youth and the others. There are so many who are in the population. The larger population is among the private sector. If we can get the private sector right and take the challenge upon us, the UN and the other agencies, and how they can go in and change them and influence them, because under one roof you will find 100,000. And if you can change them, and I'm sure that is the game changer.
Wow. Super quick wrap up, Femi, before I hand back to you, or you'll start glaring at me again. The private sector has tremendous potential to be a positive force in this area of work. They have the resources, they have the capacity, they often have the local knowledge, they have the infrastructure. But for that to happen, we need to create the context and the environment for the private sector to act in a positive way, to make sure that governance supports what they're doing, but also constrains any inappropriate actions, to make sure that we provide platforms that allow individual private sector actors to work together in a way that's safe. A little bit the de-risking that we were just discussing with Lidat. And in that combination between what we bring to the table, what local communities and governments bring to the table, and what the business sector can bring to the table, there is actually a shared values, a set of shared purposes that would align all of us in the same direction. We just need to frame that in a way that makes sense to them. Femi, thank you so much, and back to you.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, panel. Prevention in Action is a global forum convened by the UNDP. You will hear voices from outside of the UNDP, outside of the UN, and voices from within the UN who have a lot of experience to share with you. Kani Wignaraja, it's so good to see you. Unmute yourself, make yourself visible so I can greet you. Lovely to see you. Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific at UNDP. On your Twitter profile, I'm going to hold you to this because you say you enjoy a good story. So do we. And also you are inspired by those who want to change things for the better. So are we. So you have set your own bar very high. I'm handing over to you. What do you want to share with us?
Thank you, Femi. And it was really great to listen to the previous panel and also get great feedback from the ones before. So let me step right in to saying, you know, what has come out for me very strongly is that gone are the days when these notions of separations between development, humanitarian, human rights, and peace that they still hold. They never really did, but I guess we needed them for structural and political and financial reasons, whether it was in government or with the UN or with bilaterals. And now we know that these structures of understandably political and administrative convenience cannot really withstand the situations we face in the world today. And all of the colleagues who've been sharing their stories really have brought that to the fore. So we've got to take a hard, honest look, I think, of what needs to change in the way we conduct our business and in the way we finance and support efforts, and what instruments we can use to engage in what continue to be very volatile situations, because there's no straight line, right? These keep going up and down, in and out, and we've seen just even in the last panel, colleagues who spoke to certain particular country situations. So in some of the conflicts that did ease up for a while, and we managed to hold the peace, and now we see this with the different responses also to COVID, it shows us how much it has to do with putting in place, or maybe putting back in place, that commodity of trust, right, between institutions of the state and people, and how fundamental that is. And this also means, if I reflect on a very different role we expect of our leaders and what we value in great leaders who are able to navigate these periods of turbulence and bring back that middle path, right? And often done with compromises. And compromise to me has never been a bad word. In fact, it's part of the positive toolbox that we have, because it helps to address vulnerabilities and different perspectives, and brings in all the tools to put at everyone's disposal. So from a few things we've heard in the sessions, and also maybe taking from some of the stories from the Asia Pacific, where if I look at it from a glass is half full perspective, we see the activity and the sharing across these open social networks and platforms have really skyrocketed, both physical and virtual. And we see this across the region. Now, if I just, Bangladesh, Thailand are great examples that bring people together with public and private institutions. And what it really shows that everyone has a role to play and must play their part in this effort. Maybe a second thing we see is that a lot of development workers who are traditionally known as development workers are also peace builders. And maybe those who are traditional peace builders are also development workers. And they're able to now maybe use more and more the power of digital spaces, in particularly in a year that we've seen so much lockdown. So using that technology to open up spaces to mediate, to have those conversations, to ensure early warning is in place. So whether it's in the Philippines or in Fiji or Pakistan, it's shown that that's become a powerful way forward. Now, in many of our countries, we're also seeing data being used differently to bear witness, to see exactly what some of those discriminations and injustices are that are very specific to some areas, regions, communities, so we can do something about it and base it on hard evidence and not just behind kind of general statements. So some good examples that we also heard from Sri Lanka, and now we see this in Myanmar. We also are using innovations in how and what we measure, right? So to cost out the benefits, the costs and the benefits from economic point of view, environmentally, socially, and politically. So it shows hard options and it makes it very real to even those who may be working off of a very different page than we are. So making the case is an ongoing effort. It takes patience, it takes guts, but it brings in and needs fresh thinking, the new data, the tools. And if I look at Indonesia, Cambodia, these are really good examples. And maybe finally, investing in positive options for a dignified, safe life for everyone, particularly the future of young people. What they can aspire to, their future of work, their support services for mental and emotional well-being, and this sense of justice and empowerment that comes with driving gender equality. These are things that may not have all have hard data points or measures behind them, but we know that the power of these positive options and issues around dignity and safety and justice are probably what drives change most. So maybe to close my reflections, it's to say that there is the power of the public space and opening up and listening and trying new ways runs across all of these lessons, and sharing real-time information, greater transparency, really opening up that, that sense of listening to what really moves people in terms of feeling that their dignity and their sense of justice is protected is powerful. So there are things we can do in country and globally, even in moments of deep distress and when we are faced with that sense of hopelessness. So I'll end with the line that I feel that our hands are tied only if we make it so. Thanks, and back to you.
Thank you, Kani. What does prevention in action look like? What is it like from the perspective of the head of the Department for UN Policy, Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs? We're about to find that out. Hello, Carl. Welcome to the conversation. Nice to see you. Handing over to you now.
Thank you very much, Femi. And let me first just say how much I welcome this initiative, this forum. It's been inspiring to listen in as a big partner to UNDP, and now happy to participate in these final minutes of this forum. We think it's an excellent approach you also have with the inclusive, with different voices, perspectives, and with some perspectives not always being at the table in these discussions. So really impressed by the organization of this all. And also happy that the UNDP is really hosting this, showing that it's putting peace building and prevention at the center of its work. I mean, UNDP is really the operational arm of the UN system on peace building, being in the countries, implementing programs on governance, on quick impact, on justice. The evidence of that is also being the biggest beneficiary of the Peacebuilding Fund, which we support strongly. And so, of course, to be able to do that effectively on the ground, building lessons learned, strengthening capacity through these forums is important. But I think also to be a policy voice, and the voice that really pushes the developmental aspects of prevention and peace building. There's a lot of discussions on the security side, but not enough on the developmental side. We were on the Security Council 2017-18, and we were struck by how the Council focused only on the security aspects of a problem. Taking Sahel or Mali, for example, there was overwhelming time spent on discussing the robust security response to the threat of the terrorism in the country. And of course, that's an important part of the puzzle. No doubt there needs to be a robust response to the jihadists in Mali. But what we lacked was really a focus on the root causes, on the marginalization that was really driving this conflict, in the lack of inclusive politics and the lack of implementation of the peace agreement. And so we were really trying to push the UN to report on this, to provide in their reports an analysis that looked at these root causes, but also in our conclusions to be able to bring those developmental aspects to the fore, including for the mandates of the UN, but also to bring in others, conclusions that also impact funding more broadly, for example. So good to know. It's important with that, I say that UNDP is that strong developmental voice, and that us member states can then echo and bring those that message forward. I think it's a timely discussion as well that we have. I mean, we're in the midst of a massive crisis. I think we can't overestimate really the impact of the COVID crisis. It's a massive shock to the international system, probably the biggest we've had since the Second World War. I mean, certainly bigger than 9/11 or the financial crisis in 2008. And so we are in a very, should I say, fluctuous environment with massive change. Not only to the international system, of course, but also to countries, and not least to the most poor and fragile countries. So I see really in the immediate future two sets of challenges. One, of course, being the risk of lack of funding, with donors having increasing pressures also domestically and stepping away from commitments previously done. Sweden has committed to the 1%, and we remain there. And we will continue with an overall package then that remains the same. But we need to make sure that others stay and remain. And so there is enough funding for these critical interventions, because the needs will be increasing for sure. And that's the other side of the coin here, the second set of challenges. With rising inequalities, with a closing democratic space, with frustration, not least among the young, lack of trust in institutions that is increasing. There is, of course, greater risk now for more conflict and tension. And with this, we need to improve our prevention work, but we really need to invest also in the developmental aspects, as I said, of peace building. You'd asked me also to reflect on the future of peace building. I think one element here clearly is what the previous panel was discussing, the broadening of the stakeholders that are involved in the process. There is by no means member states, only countries that can change the trajectory for countries in conflict. We need a way better and broader framework of actors that participate. And that goes for the whole UN, for example, by the way. Moving forward, there is no doubt that for the UN to remain relevant, it will need to modernize and to be a platform for all kinds of stakeholders. This is true not least for the climate change agenda, but it also goes for peace building and prevention. I hope, for example, that the PBC can become that platform, at least in the UN system, bringing the different stakeholders together around coherent strategies. Second is funding, again, and I know that's been discussed a lot today as well. Here, I think the World Bank channel and source. And we need to ensure that in IDA 19, there is enough money channeled towards fragile countries, and that the strategy that has now been adopted by the bank is thoroughly implemented in practice at the country level, and that the UN is a close partner in that implementation. But we need, beyond that, of course, more resources and better quality resources. And that's why Sweden has launched a process that we call good peacebuilding funding or financing. And the idea is to bring together the big actors to find agreement around a set of principles on how we can improve both the quality and quantity of our funding. And finally, my third point on the future would be that, again, putting development and good governance really at the center of the prevention and peace building agenda. The SDGs is really a conflict prevention and peace building roadmap, if you will, and it's already there. And so that's where we really need to invest in all its aspects. And in this, of course, UNDP is relevant, and we look forward for it to play that critical role in taking this agenda forward. Well, just to conclude, I think that, as you said, we've had enough dialogue now. It's time to move for action and to really focus on making a difference in countries like Yemen, Somalia, Mali, the DRC, where it really matters. Thank you again for inviting me to talk.
Thank you for making time to join us in this Prevention in Action Global Forum on day 2, where we are right now. We've spoken about governance, we've spoken about the private sector, we've spoken about the future of peace building. It must be so difficult to be the penultimate speaker. What is left for Ulrika Mordia to say? I know she has some good stuff. She's the Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at the UNDP. Ulrika, over to you.
Thank you, Femi, and thanks to everyone who has been speaking. It's been interesting to listen and really also inspiring. And I wanted to say, Carl, if you're still with us, because I know it's late already in Stockholm, that this is not the end of the conversation. On the contrary, we have actually only just started. And as you know, UNDP is such a critical player in this field, then combining so many of the parts that needs to be put in place to really be able to work well in an environment where we have seen the past years now an increasing number of conflicts and crises. I mean, let's recall, and maybe you've done this also earlier, that we actually had a number of years, was it a decade ago, where we saw a decrease. Then we had a number of more protracted crises. They are also increasing. And now we have on top of that increasing crisis. It's really, you know, a failure with regard to the social contract, as many have said, but it's also a failure with regard to our contract with nature. And just looking at our human development report, where we for the first time also combine indicators, looking at human development, but also how we push the borders of our planet, also with UNDP's critical role in the area of biodiversity, climate change, and nature at the heart of development. We will see onwards also increasing conflicts if we don't do this the right way. And once again, I mean, action on the ground, but also partnerships. And when I'm asked sometimes, what's your favorite sustainable development goal? It may be easy then to say partnerships because you don't need to pick among the many important areas of work. But I actually and truly believe that partnerships is the way to go. The past years also, when we have seen member states opening, questioning the idea of multilateral solutions to these global challenges, playing out also at country level with conflicts that are so complex, with players that are not always in the country, but fueling the conflicts. What we need is really to work differently with partnerships. And also listening to the previous panel on the private sector engagements, it's fascinating to see that when sometimes member states step back, we actually have private sector actors stepping forward, those who want to see to that we can finance the sustainable development goal and move forwards instead of backwards. And of course, they fully understand the area that we have been mentioning again and again, a core area of UNDP, working on trust building, but also working in a long-term way to also strengthen institutions that then can deliver services in whatever country we speak about. Because of course, and we have been mentioning that actually 46% of the operations of UNDP are within crisis-affected countries, but a number of also other countries also are affected by crisis because of the result of COVID-19, and also even before that. We saw countries like Chile with a broken social contract and other examples of lack of trust, lack of belief that the future can be better than what we're experiencing now. And I think also, I mean, perhaps also alluding to what Carl said with regard to the importance of working in a coordinated way within the UN. I mean, we have seen so much of development, good ideas coming, of course, from member states wanting the UN to improve its coordination. But more than that, I would say the past year, really also the UN different entities seeing the need on the ground. Once again, Femi, to your question, what's happening on the ground. UNDP has incredible work focusing on youth groups, women groups, and we do that very much in coordination with other agencies. Kani, in your region, we have really interesting development now with regard to youth initiatives. This is also happening in the Africa continent. We're working with UNICEF, another big sister agency, but we're also doing this also with the Peacebuilding Fund and the support that we have from that kind of coordinated platform. With UN Women on women, peace and security. So there is a lot of coordination, and I think believing really in best practices and how we can build incentives for partnership through best practices, that we should look at the country experiences, these 100 countries. What are the best practices? What can we learn from them? And how can we also put them forward to actually make people believe that working together actually yields the results that we would want to see? Because Kani, you also mentioned the business case, and I recalled, and I've done that a number of times, just a couple of years ago, UNDP leading then also this on behalf of the UN system did together with the World Bank, and Carl also mentioned the importance of the World Bank and their conflict prevention work. We did a study together where we looked at the case, the business case for prevention, if you wish, and how much money we would actually save if we focused more deliberately on prevention work, and how those funds could be invested in different things than the necessary humanitarian action, than the security and military response that we need to see. And maybe it has been mentioned and will be mentioned, I mean, speaking about country examples, in the Sahel region, I mean, it has been very much a security response. And now, a number of years later, our partners also on the donor side are asking much more for our work with regard to governance, our development work, to work in pair with also the security response that of course also needs to be in place. Just also to mention, because maybe it can give those of you who haven't yet looked at, and let's see if we can also share some links on in the chat, but also through social media. I was mentioning the work that we do with youth, peace and security, women, peace and security. I also wanted to mention, and it has been brought forward the past days, because some of you may have seen that was an exciting and really interesting day in the Security Council last week with regard to climate and security, an issue that has raised to the top because there's a need for us to understand the security and the broader security implications with regard to climate change. And UNDP is hosting a hub, a mechanism that is also bringing the UN system together. So the Department of Political Affairs, UNEP, the Environment Agency, and UNDP. But what we do is really then to bring to the forefront the experiences that we have at country level in some of these conflict affected areas, and what they are experiencing in the Sahel, in Somalia, and so on the ground, to bring those discussions, that knowledge into the Security Council. We know that the Security Council is perhaps not the place to go if you are to look for solutions, but the knowledge needs to be there. The entire UN system, the entire international community needs to understand what we have ahead of us if we don't invest more also in the work besides what we have been mentioning with regard to sustainable development, the SDGs, the work UNDP does with regard to governance, trust building governments that can actually be responsible and inclusive, addressing increasing inequalities. But we also need desperately to address climate change. Otherwise, we will have so much more conflicts coming our way. Thanks, Femi. I see you raising your hand, but a lot to be said.
Ulrika, after you say the Security Council is not the place to go for solutions, that is a mic drop moment, and that is a great exit line to leave us on. Thank you so much, Ulrika. We are hastening towards the end of our global forum. Can you believe that we have had more than 8 hours of sessions between March the 3rd and March the 4th? I have a feeling that you may not have been there for all of them, apart from maybe Sam Risk and also Asaka Ogai. They were there for all of them. They were there for every single second of them. But if you haven't been there for every second of the very first Prevention in Action Global Forum 2021, it's okay. we save the recordings for you. You can relive the moments, go back and find some great speakers, some great knowledge, great contacts as well. You find their name, I know you will find them on social media or on LinkedIn. So developmentdialogues.org is the place to go, and you will find this forum's content all there in the next couple of hours. Development Dialogues, conversations between now and June about rethinking, reformulating, how does the UNDP and other stakeholders deal with crises going forward in the decade of action? I can highly recommend you look on the events calendar and check out the conversations. One in particular I want to point out to you. If you look in the chat, I've already given you all of the information right there, but on March the 5th, on Friday, this is so important, between 8 a.m. Eastern and 9:30 a.m. Eastern, that's 2 p to 3:30 p Geneva time or Central European time, a conversation about countering and tackling hate speech, grassroots conversations about Iraq, Somalia, Cameroon. I know if you can be there, you will put that in your virtual diary. I highly recommend that you do that. So here's the question: after more than 8 hours of conversation, insight, expertise, best practices, innovations, technology, how do you wrap up the UNDP's first Prevention in Action Global Forum? There's only one man for that job. That man is George Conway, Deputy Director, Crisis Bureau, UNDP. George, over to you.
I mean, great, thanks. And honestly, with the richness of this conversation and the depth of the dialogues that have taken place over the last 2 days, there's no way a summary can do justice to it. And so I have no intent of trying to, to distill more than what's already been put on the table, the extraordinary wisdom that partners, that colleagues have shared over the course of the last 2 days. I think it's been a much needed conversation, perhaps an overdue conversation. And I'm glad and I deeply respect the contributions made from across the House, from partners, from within the UN, and from the range of stakeholders in civil society and the private sector that have come together to discuss these really challenging issues that the world is facing these days. The world was already facing a very complicated crisis profile before COVID-19, and COVID-19 has complicated the situation even more. And we're seeing downturns in human development that we haven't seen in literally decades. And it really does require us to think differently. It requires us to, come up with, as Asako said in her introductory comments, bold new approaches to do things cataclysmically different, and to galvanize action in new ways. And I do hope that these discussions over the course of the past 2 days really will contribute to some altered practice on the ground collectively amongst us. And that some new partnerships will be forged moving ahead. What really did strike me, I have to say, listening in over the past 2 days, was the notable unity from the range of different partners to the dialogue: regional organizations, civil society, academia, private sector, governments, donor countries, and various partners across the UN system, all highlighted very similar challenges, very similar priorities, and a similar aspiration to really get better ahead of the curve of crises on the horizon, to stabilize progress towards the SDGs, and to do business differently. And if coming out of these dialogues, we can find some meaningful, concrete, transformative, and at-scale solutions to do business differently, then we'll be doing a good by the world and good by our stakeholders and partners. It's a changing landscape, and we need to think differently about the work that we do in this context. As Canny said, the old convenient separations of how we used to do business with silos on humanitarian work, development, peace, security, they're no longer that clear. And so we need to be thinking differently about these intersections, dealing with the multidimensionality of crisis, and understanding that it's only through well-formed and forged partnerships that we can really start to have the types of impact that we need collectively. And so I do think the spirit of conversations like this one, should they drive our collective actions moving forward, will put us collectively as partners on a much better path towards having the type of impact that will allow developing countries in crisis, and the world more generally, to look forward with hope towards the 2030 agenda in particular. So colleagues, it's been an extraordinarily useful for us dialogue on the links between prevention, peace building, development, what we can do to address the types of underlying grievances, exclusions, inequalities, injustices that cause violence to happen, that undermine progress and confidence and governance. Solutions forward by way of the importance of promoting accountable governance systems that are inclusive, responsive, and effective, but really responses that show in practice how collective agility is necessary, including from national governments, but from all development actors, to be able to respond to what is a rapidly changing world, while remaining very principled in upholding and respecting the rights of all people. So again, just in conclusion, and again, an impossible summary with the richness of the discussion that we've had over the course of the past 2 days, but my deepest thanks to the panelists, to the moderators and participants. I'd like to thank Femi in particular for the extraordinarily good facilitation. Thank you so much. I think it really kept us honest. It kept us moving forward in the discussion. Of course, a great word of thanks to Sam, to Monica, to the CIPRI team and UNDP, for organizing this, for getting the substance on the table in the right way, for the right type of discussion to happen, and also to all those working behind the scenes to keep the discussion going in such as well as it did. I know there are a couple of little challenges at different stages, but by and large, it was a solid set of discussions, and thank you for that. So Arun and the IT team, great thanks for all your behind the scenes support. Colleagues, will obviously, as Femi said, there will be recordings from these dialogues, but of course we'll also have documentation coming out of it. We will share that. We will, there's a lot of lessons to be distilled, but collectively, let's really commit to taking the thoughts and the thinking and the new ideas coming out of these dialogues and look at ways to continue to translate them into action. As Ulrika said, there is a lot of really innovative stuff happening on the ground, and it's important. It really is having impact. We need to continue to learn from it and escalate it in new places in different ways. And we do hope to have this discussion, the Prevention Forum, on an annual basis moving ahead. It's a very short decade towards the 2030 agenda. Time is moving very quickly, and we'd like to be able to keep in touch with this constituency of partners to keep this discussion on a robust track. As was also said, however, this is a first in a series of discussions over the course of the next 3 months as part of UNDP's development dialogues in response to offering development solutions to crisis. And we do look forward to your ongoing and continued participation across these, because they are an important injection of collective thinking on solutions moving ahead and how we can collectively do business differently. Thank you so much all. I do hope to see many of you over the course of the events in the next months. I hope that when we have the Prevention Forum next year, we'll have the opportunity to see you rather in person. And again, it's been a wonderful opportunity. So many thanks. Femi, back over to you.
The Prevention in Action Global Forum 2021, the inaugural edition, is now closed. Thanks for attending, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Femi, tremendously. Well done.
Thank you, Femi.
Thank you all.